The night did not announce itself with trumpets or proclamations. It arrived quietly, like a held breath, settling over France in the early hours of Friday, October 13th, 1307. The streets were dark, slick with autumn damp, the kind of cold that crept beneath cloaks and into bone. Somewhere, church bells marked the hour, indifferent to what was about to unfold. By dawn, one of the most powerful institutions in medieval history would be shattered, not by foreign enemies, but by Christian hands acting in perfect, terrifying coordination. Torches flickered against stone walls as royal soldiers moved through towns and cities with sealed orders in their possession. They had been instructed not to open them until the final moment. Obedience was absolute. When the wax seals were finally broken, the command was clear and merciless. Arrest every Knight Templar. Seize their property. Confiscate their records. Show no hesitation. No explanation was required. Monasteries that had known only prayer and discipline were suddenly surrounded by armed men. Doors were forced open. Boots echoed in corridors once reserved for silence. Elderly knights were dragged from their beds. Younger ones reached instinctively for swords they had sworn to wield only in God's service, only to find themselves outnumbered and accused of crimes so shocking they barely understood the words spoken against them. Heresy, blasphemy, idol worship, secret rituals, denial of Christ. The accusations were read aloud with cold precision, as if rehearsed. Many of the knights stood stunned, struggling to comprehend how a lifetime of devotion could be erased in a single sentence. These were men who had fought and bled in the Holy Land, who had guarded pilgrims, defended shrines, and lived under vows of poverty and obedience. Now they were branded enemies of the faith they had dedicated their lives to protect. Across France, the same scene repeated itself with uncanny synchronicity. It was not chaos, it was choreography. Someone had planned this moment carefully, ensuring there would be no warning, no escape, no chance for the order to respond as one. The efficiency alone suggested fear. Not the fear of rebellion, but the fear of something deeper, something that could not be allowed to surface. As the arrests unfolded, rumors spread faster than facts. Whispers in taverns and marketplaces twisted into wild stories by nightfall. Some said the Templars had been practicing dark rites in secret chambers. Others claimed they possessed forbidden knowledge taken from beneath the ruins of Jerusalem itself. A few dared to suggest that the order knew truths about Christianity that could unravel the authority of kings and popes alike. By morning, Paris awoke to a city transformed. The great temple fortress, once a symbol of security and order, was sealed and silent. Its treasures, rumored to be vast beyond imagination, were nowhere to be found. Ledgers vanished. Vaults stood empty. It was as if the heart of the order had been removed before the blade ever fell. King Philip IV of France, later called the Fair, watched events unfold from a position of apparent control. Publicly, he presented himself as a defender of the faith, a ruler cleansing Christendom of corruption. Privately, he was a man entangled in debt, power struggles, and humiliation. The Templars had once been his bankers, his creditors, his uneasy allies. Now they were prisoners. But even Philip could not act alone. The Knights Templar answered directly to the Pope, immune to local laws and royal interference. To destroy them required more than soldiers, it required silence from Rome. And silence on that night was exactly what followed. Pope Clement V did not immediately condemn the arrests, nor did he defend the order outright. His hesitation spoke volumes. Whether paralyzed by fear, political pressure, or uncertainty, his delay allowed the narrative to take root. Once the confessions began, extracted under methods medieval justice rarely questioned, there would be no easy path back. In dark cells, knights were subjected to unimaginable pain. Under torture, some confessed to anything demanded of them. Others broke down, naming rituals they barely recognized, symbols stripped of their meaning and recast as evidence of evil. A few held firm, insisting on their innocence even as their bodies failed them. Their words were rarely recorded with care. Outside the prisons, Europe watched with a mixture of shock and fascination. How could an order so revered fall so completely, so quickly? How could men once hailed as God's warriors be recast as heretics overnight? The speed of their destruction suggested not discovery, but decision. Not justice, but necessity. And beneath it all lingered a question few dared to ask openly. Why now? The Templars were no longer fighting in the Holy Land. Their original purpose had faded with the loss of Jerusalem. Yet their power remained, financial, logistical, symbolic. They owned land across Europe, commanded loyalty from thousands, and operated beyond the reach of any single crown. In a world shifting toward centralized monarchies, such independence was intolerable. Still, power alone does not explain erasure. Because what followed was not merely the dismantling of an organization. It was the systematic attempt to remove it from memory. Records were destroyed or altered. Symbols were banned. Even speaking in defense of the order became dangerous. The message was unmistakable. Whatever the Knights Templar represented, it must not survive. Not in truth, not in legend. As fires burned and trials dragged on, something else became clear. The story being told did not align with the evidence left behind. Confessions contradicted each other. Charges shifted. Witnesses disappeared. And the greatest mystery of all remained unanswered. Where had the order's wealth gone? For an institution accused of corruption and excess, the absence of treasure was deafening. Ships had left Templar ports days before the arrests. Carts had moved under cover of night. Trusted allies had vanished into the countryside. It was as if the knights had known, at least some of them, that this moment was coming. If so, then the night of October 13th was not just an ending. It was a severing, a deliberate cut meant to separate the visible Templars, the men who could be arrested, tried, and executed, from something else that could not be so easily destroyed. Knowledge, perhaps, networks, ideas, or a secret that, once revealed, would shake the foundations of medieval belief. As the last torches burned low and the prisons filled, Europe believed it was witnessing the fall of a disgraced order. But history rarely moves so cleanly. What looks like an ending is often a transformation. And what is erased from the page sometimes survives in the margins. The Knights Templar would never again ride openly under their red cross. But whether they truly fell that night, or simply disappeared into history's shadows, is a question that still refuses to rest. Because orders do not vanish without leaving echoes. And secrets, once buried, have a way of waiting. Long before torches lit the streets of France, before accusations and trials and flames, the world that gave birth to the Knights Templar was already soaked in blood, dust, and uncertainty. The year was 1119, and Jerusalem, recently seized by Christian armies during the First Crusade, was a city balanced on the edge of triumph and terror. Pilgrims arrived from across Europe believing the holy city had been reclaimed for Christ, only to find the roads leading to it haunted by bandits, deserters, and remnants of war who showed no mercy to the unarmed faithful. The victory of the Crusades had been incomplete. Yes, Jerusalem was in Christian hands, but the land around it remained volatile, fractured, and dangerous. Thousands of pilgrims traveled vast distances to pray at sacred sites, often selling everything they owned for the journey. Many never made it. They were robbed, beaten, or killed along the way, their faith tested not by doubt, but by steel. It was in this fragile, violent landscape that a small group of knights made an unusual proposal. They were not kings or nobles commanding armies, but seasoned warriors shaped by crusade and loss. Led by a French knight named Hugues de Payens, they approached Baldwin II, king of Jerusalem, with an offer that seemed almost naive in its simplicity. They would dedicate their lives to protecting pilgrims on the roads to the holy city. There was nothing grand about them. Contemporary accounts suggest there were only 9 knights at first, poorly equipped and living modestly. They took vows similar to monks: poverty, chastity, obedience, yet they carried swords instead of rosaries. In a world that separated prayer from warfare, this fusion was radical, even unsettling. To fight was to kill. To kill was to sin. And yet, these men proposed to sanctify violence itself. King Baldwin, facing constant threats and lacking manpower, accepted. He granted them quarters on the Temple Mount, in a wing of the former Al-Aqsa Mosque. Christians believed this structure stood atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. From this location, the Knights would take their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would remember them simply as the Knights Templar. The irony was stark. Despite their growing legend, these early Templars were desperately poor. One of the most famous images associated with them shows two knights riding a single horse, less a symbol of brotherhood than a reflection of scarcity. Their armor was mismatched, their weapons worn. What they possessed in abundance was conviction. Yet conviction alone did not ensure survival. For nearly a decade, the order existed in relative obscurity, respected locally but unknown in Europe. They had no formal recognition from the Church, no clear legal status, and no guarantee of protection. In many ways, they were an experiment, one that could have ended quietly had the winds of history shifted slightly differently. What changed everything was not a battlefield victory, but a voice. In 1128, at the Council of Troyes in France, the Templars' fate was argued before the most powerful religious figures of the age. Their cause was championed by Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential theologians in Christendom. Bernard was no ordinary supporter. His words carried immense weight, capable of shaping doctrine and directing kings. In his treatise praising the new knighthood, Bernard reframed the very concept of holy war. A Templar, he argued, did not kill out of hatred or greed, but out of obedience. When a knight of the Temple struck down an enemy, it was not murder, it was the eradication of evil. For the first time, the Church openly sanctified a warrior's blade. With that blessing, the Templars were transformed. They received official recognition from the papacy and were granted a rule, a strict code governing every aspect of their lives. They wore white mantles symbolizing purity, later marked with a red cross that represented both martyrdom and divine mission. They ate in silence, prayed constantly, and trained relentlessly. Individual identity dissolved into collective purpose. Europe took notice. Nobles eager to secure their salvation donated land, money, and sons to the order. Entire estates were signed over to the Templars, who managed them with ruthless efficiency. Young men joined seeking purpose, redemption, or glory. Others were sent by families who believed service in the order could cleanse bloodlines and sins alike. Within a generation, the Templars evolved from 9 obscure knights into an international force. They built fortresses across the Holy Land and commanderies throughout Europe. They protected pilgrims not only with swords, but with systems, safe houses, guarded roads, organized logistics. They began to resemble not merely warriors, but administrators of security in a chaotic world. And yet, even in these early years, there were hints that the order's path would diverge from expectation. Stationed on the Temple Mount, the Templars lived atop layers of ancient history. Jewish, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic civilizations had all claimed the ground beneath their feet. While their primary duty was protection, legends soon arose that the knights had begun exploring beneath the site, clearing passages, examining ruins, and uncovering relics long forgotten. No contemporary records confirm exactly what they found, if anything at all. But silence itself became suggestive. The Templars were famously meticulous record-keepers, yet almost nothing survives describing their earliest years in Jerusalem. Later generations would fill the void with speculation. Sacred texts, lost artifacts, or knowledge suppressed by time. Whether truth or myth, the idea took root early, that the order's foundation was not solely military, but custodial. That they guarded something older and more fragile than pilgrims. Something that, if mishandled, could alter how the world understood faith itself. Even without secrets, their very existence was a paradox. They were monks sworn to humility, yet they rode into battle clad in armor. They renounced personal wealth, yet they managed vast resources. They preached obedience, yet answered only to God and the Pope. These contradictions did not weaken the order, they defined it. For the men within its ranks, the Templar life was harsh and absolute. Personal ambition had no place. A knight owned nothing, not even his own body. Injury, death, and anonymity were accepted as the cost of purpose. In return, they gained something rare in the medieval world: certainty. A belief that their suffering mattered, that their actions fit into a divine plan beyond question. It was this certainty that made the Templars formidable and dangerous, because institutions built on absolute conviction rarely bend. They endure or they break. In the beginning, the Knights Templar were neither rich nor feared. They were a response to chaos, a solution born from desperation and belief. But as their numbers grew and their mission expanded, they began to shape the very world they had been created to serve. And history, watching from a distance, was already preparing to ask a darker question. What happens when faith becomes power? As the idea of the warrior monk took hold, the world struggled to understand what the Knights Templar truly were. They did not fit neatly into any existing role. Monks were meant to withdraw from violence, to seek God through silence and prayer. Knights, by contrast, lived by the sword, bound to feudal lords and personal honor. The Templars existed in the space between these identities, and that uneasy fusion would define both their strength and the fear they inspired. Life within the order was governed by a rule stricter than most monasteries. Every hour of the day was regulated. Before dawn, the brothers rose for prayer, their voices echoing in stone chapels long before the sun touched the horizon. They ate plain meals in silence, listening to scripture as they chewed coarse bread and drank watered wine. Their clothing was simple, their possessions limited to the bare minimum required for survival and combat. Even a knight's horse was not truly his own. It belonged to the order. Obedience was absolute. A Templar did not question commands, even when they led toward danger or death. Personal fear was considered a weakness of the flesh, something to be conquered through discipline and faith. If a knight fled the battlefield without orders, the punishment could be expulsion or worse. To stand firm, even when outnumbered, was not bravery. It was duty. This discipline translated directly onto the battlefield. Unlike feudal armies that broke apart once leaders fell, Templar units moved as a single body. They charged when commanded, held their ground when ordered, and withdrew only as one. Muslim chroniclers of the Crusades noted this with a mixture of respect and alarm. These men did not fight for plunder or personal glory. They fought as if already dead. Yet the Templars were not reckless. Their commanders were trained to think strategically, to understand terrain, logistics, and supply lines. Over time, the order developed a military professionalism rare in the medieval world. Castles were placed with precision. Patrol routes were mapped. Signals and standards allowed coordination across chaos. In an age when warfare was often disorganized and impulsive, the Templars brought structure. The red cross sewn onto their white mantles became both a rallying point and a warning. To Christian forces, it signaled reliability, a unit that would not abandon the field. To their enemies, it marked fighters who would advance without hesitation. Captured Templars were often executed immediately, not out of cruelty alone, but because releasing them was considered too dangerous. But the battlefield was only one aspect of their transformation. As the order expanded, it became clear that swords alone could not sustain a long war. Armies needed food, weapons, horses, and money. Managing these necessities across continents required organization beyond anything Europe had previously known. The Templars proved remarkably adept at this. They established a network of commanderies stretching from the Holy Land to the British Isles. Each acted as a hub for resources, communication, and recruitment. Donations flowed in, some given freely, others in exchange for spiritual benefits. Land was farmed efficiently, livestock managed carefully, and profits reinvested. Unlike many noble estates, Templar holdings were rarely neglected or mismanaged. From this system emerged something revolutionary. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem could deposit money with the Templars in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land using letters of credit. This protected them from theft and reduced the risks of long-distance travel. In effect, the order had created an early form of international banking. It was a practical solution born of necessity, but it had profound consequences. Kings began to rely on the Templars to store treasure, fund wars, and manage ransoms. The order's fortresses doubled as vaults. Their records tracked debts and payments with precision. In a fragmented medieval economy, the Templars offered stability. And stability breeds dependence. As their influence grew, so did their independence. Papal privileges exempted them from local taxes and laws. They answered only to the Pope, not to kings or bishops. A Templar house in France operated under the same authority as one in Jerusalem. This supranational identity was unprecedented and deeply unsettling to secular rulers. To many nobles, the Templars represented an ideal: disciplined, incorruptible, devoted to a higher cause. To others, they were an invisible empire operating within the fabric of Christendom. They owned land but owed no fealty. They handled money but professed poverty. They wielded violence but claimed spiritual purity. Inside the order, this tension was carefully managed. Brothers were constantly reminded that wealth belonged to God, not to them. A knight could not touch money without permission. Even successful commanders lived no more lavishly than new recruits. In theory, the system worked. In practice, the sheer scale of their operations blurred the line between service and power. Still, for decades, the Templars remained indispensable. They guarded key routes, defended fortresses, and served as the backbone of Crusader armies. When other forces hesitated, the Templars advanced. When morale faltered, their presence steadied the line. Their reputation grew with each engagement, reinforced by stories of unwavering resolve. But the same qualities that made them effective also isolated them. Their secrecy, discipline, and autonomy fostered suspicion. Ordinary people saw them pass through towns in silence, faces hidden beneath helms, red crosses stark against white cloth. They were familiar yet distant, part of the Christian world, yet somehow apart from it. Over time, legends began to grow around them. Some spoke of secret rituals known only to initiates. Others claimed the Templars possessed ancient knowledge gained in the East, wisdom lost to Europe since antiquity. Most of these stories had no solid foundation, but they filled the gaps left by the order's silence. And the Templars did little to dispel them. Secrecy was not merely habit, it was protection. In hostile territories, discretion could mean survival. In Europe, however, it fed curiosity and fear. When people do not understand an institution, they imagine. And imagination, unchecked, often drifts toward the forbidden. As the Crusades dragged on and fortunes shifted, the Templars' role became even more complex. They were no longer just defenders of pilgrims or soldiers of Christ. They were administrators, financiers, diplomats, and symbols. Their existence challenged the traditional balance between church and state, faith and force. By becoming something entirely new, the Templars had secured their place in history. They had also planted the seeds of their own destruction, because power that cannot be controlled will eventually be confronted. And an order that belongs fully to neither heaven nor earth will always be viewed as a threat by those who rule both. The warrior monks had proven that faith could be weaponized, organized, and sustained. The question that lingered, unspoken but inevitable, was how long the world would tolerate such a force before deciding it was too dangerous to exist. The moment the Church placed its seal upon the Knights Templar, the balance of power in medieval Europe shifted in ways few could fully grasp. What had begun as a small band of devoted warriors was now something far more formidable. An institution shielded by divine authority and elevated above the laws that governed ordinary men. This transformation did not happen gradually. It arrived through parchment and proclamation, through papal words that carried the weight of heaven itself. At the heart of this change were a series of papal decrees that redefined what the Templars were, and, more importantly, what they were not. They were not subject to local bishops. They were not bound by feudal obligations. They were not required to pay taxes to kings or nobles. Instead, they answered directly to the Pope, bypassing the entire hierarchy of medieval power. To many within the Church, this arrangement seemed practical. The Holy Land required defenders who could act swiftly, unburdened by politics and regional disputes. The Templars, disciplined and obedient, appeared to be the perfect instrument. By placing them under papal protection, the Church ensured that its chosen warriors could operate freely in service of Christendom. But what seemed like efficiency to Rome looked like danger to kings. Across Europe, rulers watched as the Templars built fortresses, acquired land, and moved resources across borders without seeking permission. A Templar commander could refuse a royal order if it conflicted with papal instructions, and suffer no consequence. In an age where authority was fiercely contested, such immunity was almost unimaginable. The order's churches and houses became islands of papal sovereignty scattered throughout the continent. A man fleeing justice could cross a threshold marked by the Red Cross and find himself beyond the reach of local law. Taxes levied on peasants did not apply within Templar lands. Even bishops found their authority limited when dealing with the order. The message was clear: the Templars existed above ordinary constraints. This exceptional status bred resentment. Nobles complained that their lands were being swallowed by an institution they could not control. Bishops resented the loss of influence. Merchants bristled at competition from an organization that could move goods without paying customary dues. What had once been admiration slowly curdled into suspicion. Yet, from the Church's perspective, the Templars were invaluable. They provided not only military muscle but logistical support for crusades that would otherwise collapse under their own weight. They stored relics, transported funds, and ensured that armies could be fed and equipped far from home. Without them, the dream of a sustained Christian presence in the Holy Land would have been impossible. The relationship between the papacy and the Templars was therefore not merely spiritual, it was strategic. By empowering the order, the Church strengthened its own reach into secular affairs. The Red Cross became an extension of papal will, planted firmly in territories where Rome's direct authority was limited. But power, once granted, is rarely returned. As the order expanded, it developed internal structures that rivaled those of states. Grand Masters commanded vast resources. Regional commanders oversaw networks of estates and fortresses. Decisions were made collectively, with a degree of autonomy that allowed rapid response to crises. The Templars did not wait for permission, they acted. This independence was reinforced by ideology. Templars were taught that obedience to the order was obedience to God. To question a superior was to question divine will. This belief created cohesion, but it also insulated the order from external influence. Kings could threaten, bishops could protest. The Templars remained unmoved. For ordinary people, the presence of the Templars was both reassuring and unsettling. They were protectors, yes, but they were also reminders of a higher authority that transcended local rule. A Templar procession through a town was a display of disciplined power, silent, ordered, and unyielding. It inspired awe and sometimes fear. Over time, this aura took on a mythic quality. The Templars were seen not simply as soldiers, but as agents of a divine agenda known only to themselves and the Pope. Their privileges seemed endless, their influence invisible but pervasive. And because their inner workings were largely hidden from public view, speculation flourished. Why did the Church grant such freedom to one order and not others? What assurances had the Templars given in return? What knowledge or leverage did they possess that made them indispensable? No clear answers were offered, and silence invited imagination. Meanwhile, the political landscape of Europe was changing. Monarchs were consolidating power, building centralized administrations, and asserting control over their territories. The feudal patchwork that had defined earlier centuries was giving way to stronger states with clearer boundaries and ambitions. In this new environment, an organization that operated beyond borders and laws was an anomaly and a challenge. Some rulers attempted to negotiate with the Templars, seeking alliances or financial support. Others tried to limit their influence through legal means, only to discover that papal protection rendered such efforts ineffective. The frustration was palpable. The order could not be ignored, yet it could not be controlled. Even within the Church, unease began to surface. The Templars' growing wealth, however carefully managed, sat uneasily alongside their vows of poverty. Their military role blurred the line between spiritual mission and worldly ambition. Critics whispered that the order had grown too powerful, too independent, too necessary. But necessity is a dangerous justification. As long as the crusading ideal burned brightly, the Templars' role seemed justified. They were defenders of the faith, guardians of sacred ground. Yet as Crusader territories fell and the Holy Land slipped from Christian control, questions arose. What was the purpose of such an empowered order if its original mission could no longer be fulfilled? The privileges remained. The exemptions persisted. But the context that had once made them acceptable was fading. In Europe, the Templars now stood as a powerful institution without a clear enemy. They still trained, still prayed, still managed vast resources. But their swords had fewer places to strike. Their castles, once bulwarks against invasion, now loomed over peaceful countryside. To some, this made them relics of an earlier age. To others, it made them unpredictable. And unpredictability is the enemy of authority. By elevating the Templars above kings and laws, the Church had created a force it could not easily restrain. By granting them divine legitimacy, it had shielded them from accountability. What had begun as a tool to protect Christendom now stood as a parallel power within it. The irony was profound. The very protections meant to ensure the order's survival would later be used as evidence of its arrogance. Its independence would be reframed as defiance, its privileges as proof of corruption. When the moment came to turn against the Templars, their extraordinary status would not save them. It would condemn them, because in a world where authority is contested, those who stand above the rules become targets, not for what they have done, but for what they represent. And the Church's chosen weapon, once so carefully forged, would eventually be seen as too sharp to keep. At first, the wealth of the Knights Templar was almost invisible. It did not glitter in jewelry or spill out in lavish banquets. It arrived quietly, folded into parchments, measured in fields and mills rather than coins. Donors did not give to enrich individual knights, but to secure divine favor. A vineyard here, a herd of sheep there, a modest sum offered on a deathbed in hopes of salvation. Each gift was small on its own. Together, they formed something unprecedented. The order's vow of poverty was genuine at the individual level. A Templar knight owned nothing personally. His cloak, his sword, even the horse beneath him belonged to the order. If he died, nothing passed to heirs. There were no heirs. In this way, wealth did not fragment or dissolve over generations. It accumulated, stable and centralized, growing stronger with time. Unlike feudal lords, who often squandered resources on war or luxury, the Templars managed their holdings with cold efficiency. Estates were carefully organized. Crops were rotated. Surpluses were sold. Profits were recorded and reinvested. The order did not gamble with its future, planned for it. As crusades intensified, so did the flow of donations. Knights departing for the Holy Land entrusted their lands to the Templars, often permanently. Some signed contracts stipulating that their property would return to their families if they survived. Many never did. The land remained with the order, absorbed quietly into its expanding network. What began as support for a spiritual mission soon evolved into a sophisticated economic system. Templar houses dotted Europe's trade routes, ports, and river crossings. Their presence offered security, not just for pilgrims, but for merchants. Where the Red Cross flew, theft was rare and contracts were honored. It was here that the order's most transformative innovation took shape. Long-distance travel in the medieval world was dangerous. Carrying large sums of money invited robbery. The Templars solved this problem by separating wealth from movement. A pilgrim or noble could deposit funds at a Templar house in Paris and receive a coded document. Weeks later, in Acre or Jerusalem, that document could be redeemed for an equivalent sum. This was more than convenience. It was trust made tangible. The system relied on meticulous record-keeping, secure communication, and internal discipline. Forgery was nearly impossible. Theft within the order was punished severely. Over time, the Templars became the most reliable financial institution in Christendom, centuries before the concept officially existed. Kings noticed. Rulers burdened by the costs of war and governance turned to the Templars for loans. Royal treasuries were stored in Templar vaults. Taxes collected on behalf of the crown passed through their hands. In some cases, entire state budgets depended on their administration. Yet the order charged no interest in the modern sense, avoiding accusations of usury. Instead, they collected fees for services, storage, and transport. The distinction mattered. It allowed them to operate within church law while functioning effectively as bankers. This dual role, holy warriors and financial stewards, made the Templars indispensable and deeply resented. Other groups could not compete. Local lenders lacked their reach and protection. Nobles envied their stability. Merchants chafed at their exemptions. And all the while, the order insisted that it sought no wealth for itself, only the means to serve God's will. From the inside, this may have been true. From the outside, it looked like hypocrisy. Rumors began to circulate. If the knights were sworn to poverty, why did they control such vast riches? If they served only Christ, why did kings owe them money? The contradiction was too tempting to ignore. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Templar wealth was how little of it could be seen. Unlike monarchs who displayed power through pageantry, the Templars practiced restraint. Their churches were austere, their attire plain. There were no public displays of gold or silver. Wealth moved silently, transformed into stone walls, armed escorts, and parchment records. This invisibility made their power difficult to measure, and therefore easy to exaggerate. Stories spread of hidden vaults beneath Templar fortresses, of treasures taken from Jerusalem and never revealed. Some claimed the order possessed relics of unimaginable value. Others believed they guarded knowledge more precious than gold. Fact and fantasy blurred, feeding a growing sense that the Templars were hiding something. In truth, much of their wealth was already spoken for. Funds were constantly redirected to support garrisons in the east, to repair fortifications, to feed and equip brothers. War consumed resources at an astonishing rate. The order was wealthy, yes, but also perpetually committed. Still, perception mattered more than reality. As Europe's political climate hardened, wealth became a source of vulnerability. Monarchs who once praised the Templars began to resent their independence. Debts weighed heavily. In times of financial strain, the existence of a wealthy, untaxed institution answering to no king was intolerable. For rulers like Philip IV of France, this resentment was personal. The crown owed enormous sums to the Templars, accumulated through wars and administrative costs. Repayment was difficult. Default was humiliating. Elimination, however, offered an alternative. The idea took hold that the order's wealth was illegitimate, that it had been acquired through deception, heresy, or secret crimes. If the Templars could be discredited, their assets could be seized. What began as financial frustration slowly transformed into moral accusation. Yet even as tensions grew, the order continued its work, seemingly unaware of how precarious its position had become. Accounts were balanced, estates managed, funds transferred. Life within the order remained austere, focused on duty rather than danger. This was their great miscalculation. They believed their service insulated them. That necessity ensured protection. That no Christian ruler would dare dismantle an institution so deeply woven into the fabric of Christendom's economy and defense. They underestimated how powerful greed becomes when disguised as righteousness. By the time accusations surfaced, the groundwork had already been laid. The image of the wealthy, secretive Templar had taken root in the public imagination. The idea that their riches were not merely material, but forbidden, made the charges that followed easier to accept. And when the arrests finally came, one detail stood out above all others. The treasure everyone expected to find was gone. Vaults were empty, ledgers incomplete, ships had sailed, carts had moved under cover of night. The wealth that had defined the order's power seemed to have evaporated. Whether this was foresight, coincidence, or something more deliberate would become one of the enduring mysteries of the Templars. Because wealth does not simply disappear. It is moved, and whoever controlled that movement controlled far more than gold. The place where the Knights Templar first laid down their cloaks was not chosen at random. High above the city of Jerusalem, on a plateau layered with sacred memory, they were given quarters on the Temple Mount itself. To the faithful, this was the holiest ground on earth, the site where Solomon's temple once stood, where God's presence was believed to have dwelled. To the Templars, it was both sanctuary and symbol, a physical link between their mission and the deepest roots of biblical history. Their residence occupied part of what Christians called the Temple of Solomon, a structure that Muslims knew as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Beneath its floors lay centuries of rubble and ruins, remnants of Jewish temples, Roman buildings, and Byzantine constructions. The ground was a palimpsest of civilizations, each built upon the last, each leaving traces behind. For nearly a decade, the Templars lived there in relative obscurity, protected by royal favor and largely ignored by the wider world. It was during these early years, when their numbers were small and their movements unremarked, that one of history's most persistent mysteries is said to have begun. Accounts from later centuries claim that the Templars undertook extensive activity beneath the Temple Mount. They are said to have cleared ancient tunnels, explored subterranean chambers, and removed debris that had accumulated over generations. There are no surviving Templar records confirming such operations. Yet the absence of documentation has only deepened speculation. The Temple Mount was no ordinary foundation. Jewish tradition held that it was the location of the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of Solomon's temple, where the Ark of the Covenant once rested. Legends spoke of sacred objects hidden away before the Babylonian destruction, preserved for a future age. By the time the Crusaders arrived, these stories had already passed into myth, but myths rarely fade entirely. The Templars, educated and deeply religious, would have been well aware of these traditions. Living atop such ground, it is difficult to imagine they would not have been curious. Whether driven by faith, duty, or simple human wonder, the idea that they might have searched beneath their own quarters is not implausible. What they may have found, if anything, remains unknown. Some theories suggest the discovery of religious relics, fragments of sacred vessels, ancient texts, or ceremonial objects linked to early Judaism or Christianity. Others propose something more abstract but equally powerful, knowledge preserved in symbols, geometry, or writings that challenged orthodox interpretations of Scripture. There are also those who believe the Templars uncovered nothing tangible at all, and that the legend arose later, constructed to explain their sudden rise and unusual influence. In a world hungry for meaning, the idea that their power stemmed from hidden wisdom was irresistible. Yet certain details resist easy dismissal. The Templars' name itself emphasized the Temple of Solomon, a choice that went beyond geography. Their symbolism drew heavily on Old Testament imagery. Their seals, rituals, and later architecture hinted at an obsession with sacred space and ancient continuity. Even their orientation toward Jerusalem carried layers of significance that extended beyond military strategy. After leaving the Holy Land, Templar churches across Europe often incorporated unusual design elements, octagonal layouts, precise alignments, and symbolic proportions. While such features were not unique to the order, their consistency suggested shared principles. Whether these reflected theological ideals, architectural fashion, or something learned earlier remains open to interpretation. What is certain is that secrecy surrounded the order's inner life. Initiation rituals were private. Meetings were closed. Outsiders were not permitted to observe internal ceremonies. In a medieval society where public worship was the norm, this discretion was notable. Secrecy alone does not imply wrongdoing. Military organizations often guard their practices. But combined with rumors of underground activity at one of the world's most sacred sites, it became fertile ground for suspicion. As centuries passed, stories grew more elaborate. Some claimed the Templars discovered the Ark of the Covenant itself, a relic believed to hold divine power. Others suggested they found proof that challenged the Church's teachings, alternative accounts of Christ's life, or symbols pointing to a lineage rather than a doctrine. No evidence supports these claims, but neither can they be conclusively disproven. What complicates the picture further is the timing of the order's transformation. Within a generation of settling on the Temple Mount, the Templars evolved from impoverished knights into one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. Their rise cannot be attributed solely to relics or secrets, but the coincidence is striking. It is possible that the Temple Mount gave them something less dramatic but equally valuable: legitimacy. By anchoring their identity to the site of Solomon's temple, they positioned themselves as heirs to a sacred tradition older than Christianity itself. This connection resonated deeply in a medieval world that revered antiquity and divine continuity. In this sense, the treasure of the temple may have been symbolic rather than material. Yet symbolism can be as powerful as gold. The belief that the Templars guarded ancient wisdom followed them long after they left Jerusalem. When accusations of heresy later emerged, they drew upon these legends. Strange rites were reinterpreted as echoes of forbidden knowledge. Symbols became signs of apostasy. The mystery of the Temple Mount was weaponized. What had once elevated the order now contributed to its downfall. And still, the silence remains. No confession under torture revealed a lost relic. No inventory listed a sacred artifact taken from beneath Jerusalem. No credible witness described a discovery that could explain everything. The gap between legend and record persists, stubborn and unresolved. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the temple beneath the temple. Not a single hidden object, but a question that cannot be closed. A reminder that some chapters of history were never written or were deliberately erased. When the Templars were finally destroyed, their enemies searched desperately for proof of their supposed crimes. If they believed the order possessed a dangerous secret, they never found it. Which leaves one unsettling possibility. Whatever the Templars may have learned beneath the stones of Jerusalem, they either carried it with them in ways no interrogator could extract, or it was never something that could be seized at all. Some secrets are not hidden in vaults. They are buried in silence. By the time the Knights Templar had become a familiar presence across Europe, a strange transformation had taken place. They were no longer judged solely by what they did, but by what people believed they did in secret. Their public image, disciplined, silent, obedient, created a void that rumor eagerly filled. And in medieval Europe, few accusations were as dangerous as heresy. The first whispers were subtle. A strange custom here, an unfamiliar gesture there. Initiation ceremonies conducted behind closed doors. Oaths sworn in darkness. These details, ordinary within many religious orders, took on a different tone when applied to men who wielded both swords and wealth. The Templars were powerful, and power always invites suspicion. Over time, the rumors sharpened into specific claims. It was said that new recruits were required to deny Christ during initiation, that they spat on the cross as a test of obedience, that they worshipped an idol, sometimes described as a bearded head, sometimes as a mysterious figure called Baphomet, that they practiced secret rites learned in the East, corrupted by contact with Muslims, Jews, or older, forbidden traditions. To modern ears, these accusations sound theatrical, even absurd. But in the medieval mind, they were lethal. Heresy was not merely a theological error, it was a threat to the cosmic order. To accuse someone of heresy was to accuse them of inviting divine punishment upon the entire community. What made these claims particularly potent was their ambiguity. No single version of the alleged heresies ever fully aligned. Confessions contradicted one another. Descriptions shifted depending on the interrogator. Yet the lack of consistency did not weaken the accusations. It strengthened them, because inconsistency suggested secrecy. The Templars' internal discipline ensured that very few outsiders understood their rituals. Initiations were conducted privately, as was common practice. New brothers swore vows not to reveal the order's internal matters. This secrecy, designed to protect cohesion and trust, would later be reframed as evidence of conspiracy. Even mundane practices were reinterpreted. The order emphasized obedience above all else, teaching recruits to submit their will entirely. In a courtroom, this became proof that knights would commit sacrilege if ordered. Ritual kisses exchanged as signs of brotherhood were twisted into accusations of indecency. Symbolic gestures were stripped of context and turned into scandal. What is striking is how familiar these accusations were. They echoed earlier charges leveled against other groups the Church found threatening. Early Christians themselves had once been accused of cannibalism and secret rites by Roman authorities. Heretical movements were often condemned using similar language. The pattern was well established. When an institution grew too powerful or too independent, heresy became the weapon of choice. And the Templars, by their nature, made an ideal target. Their exposure to the Islamic world further fueled suspicion. Crusader states were places of cultural exchange as much as conflict. Languages were learned. Medical knowledge was shared. Philosophical texts circulated. To many Europeans who never left their villages, this contact alone was dangerous. Some whispered that the Templars respected their enemies too much, that they admired Islamic discipline, organization, even spirituality, that they had absorbed ideas incompatible with Christian doctrine. These claims were exaggerated, but they tapped into a deep anxiety about contamination, of faith, of identity. The mysterious figure later called Baphomet illustrates this perfectly. No contemporary Templar text mentions such an idol. Descriptions from later trials vary wildly. A head with 3 faces, a skull, a cat, a demon, a symbol. The name itself may be a corruption of words meaning father of wisdom, or a misheard term filtered through fear. It is possible that some knights misunderstood symbolic language used in rituals, or repeated phrases without grasping their meaning. Under torture, such fragments could be reshaped into anything an interrogator wished to hear. Pain has a way of turning confusion into confession, and torture was central to how these heresies were revealed. When the trials began, many knights initially denied all charges. Only after prolonged suffering did confessions emerge. Even then, some recanted when the pain stopped, insisting they had lied to escape agony. Others died before speaking at all. Very few confessions were consistent, and fewer still were voluntary. Yet, in the logic of medieval justice, confession, even under torture, was proof enough. The most unsettling aspect is how easily the narrative took hold. People wanted to believe it. The Templars were wealthy yet claimed poverty. Powerful yet claimed humility. Silent yet omnipresent. Heresy provided a simple explanation for complex discomfort. If the order had truly been corrupt, then its fall was righteous. This psychological comfort mattered. It allowed kings to seize assets without guilt. It allowed the church to distance itself from an institution it had once championed. It allowed ordinary people to reconcile admiration with betrayal. But beneath the accusations lies a deeper question. What if the so-called heresies were not invented entirely, but distorted reflections of something real, something misunderstood? The Templars' worldview was shaped by constant exposure to death. They lived with the certainty of mortality, trained to die without fear. This produced a theology focused less on external ritual and more on inner obedience. Some scholars suggest that initiation ceremonies emphasized detachment from symbols, even from the cross itself, to prepare knights for situations where faith would be tested under threat. In this interpretation, symbolic denial of Christ was not a rejection of belief, but a rehearsal for survival under capture, teaching knights to preserve life and loyalty under coercion. Such practices, stripped of context, would appear blasphemous. But nuance rarely survives interrogation. Once the label of heresy was applied, it became self-reinforcing. Every silence was guilt. Every denial was defiance. Every inconsistency was proof of deeper deception. The truth, whatever it was, no longer mattered, and perhaps that was the point. Heresy was never about theology alone. It was about control, about defining who belonged and who did not. By accusing the Templars of secret corruption, their enemies reframed the order not as a rival power, but as an existential threat. A threat that had to be eliminated. Whether the Templars truly held unorthodox beliefs, or whether they were victims of a narrative crafted for convenience, may never be fully resolved. The records we have are filtered through fear, ambition, and pain. What remains is the unsettling realization that belief itself can be weaponized, that silence can be interpreted as guilt, and that secrecy, once necessary for survival, can later be recast as evidence of unforgivable crime. In the end, the heresies attributed to the Knights Templar tell us less about what they believed, and more about what the world needed them to be in order to justify what came next. Because once an enemy is declared heretical, anything done to them becomes holy. The fall of the Crusader strongholds did not come all at once. It arrived city by city, fortress by fortress, like a tide that could no longer be held back. For generations, the Knights Templar had been shaped by life on the frontier, where danger was constant and purpose was clear. But when the great bastions of the Holy Land began to crumble, the order faced a challenge more dangerous than any enemy army: irrelevance. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 was a shock that reverberated across Christendom. Though the city was later contested and partially reclaimed, the sense of divine momentum was broken. Each subsequent defeat chipped away at the vision that had justified endless sacrifice. By the time Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, fell in 1291, the dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the East was over. For the Templars, this was not merely a military setback. It was an existential crisis. Their identity had been forged around a singular mission: the defense of pilgrims and sacred sites in the Holy Land. Without Jerusalem, without the roads they had sworn to protect, their role became uncertain. They still possessed discipline, manpower, and resources, but toward what end? The order withdrew westward, regrouping in Europe. Their fortresses in the east were abandoned or destroyed. Brothers who had spent their lives in constant warfare now found themselves stationed in familiar lands, surrounded by fields and towns instead of desert and siege engines. The transition was unsettling. In Europe, they were no longer heroic defenders of distant holy ground. They were wealthy landholders, administrators, and creditors. Their castles dominated countryside that knew no enemy. Their training grounds echoed with drills that seemed increasingly theoretical. And Europe had changed while they were gone. Kings had grown stronger, bureaucracies more sophisticated, loyalties more centralized. Where the Templars once filled a vital role in a fragmented world, they now stood apart, an institution without a clear place in the emerging order. Some within the Church began to question the order's purpose. If the Holy Land could not be reclaimed, what justification remained for a permanent militarized religious order? Other groups, like the Hospitallers, adapted by shifting focus toward medical care and naval defense. The Templars, bound by tradition and identity, struggled to redefine themselves. Yet they did not fade quietly. The order retained its privileges, its exemptions, its independence. It continued to collect revenues, manage estates, and maintain military readiness. To rulers facing financial strain, this persistence felt provocative. Why should an organization created for a failed mission continue to operate beyond royal control? In France, this question carried particular weight. King Philip IV ruled a kingdom burdened by war, debt, and political ambition. He sought to strengthen royal authority and reduce dependence on external powers, especially the papacy. The Templars, with their wealth and autonomy, stood directly in his way. What had once been an alliance of convenience had soured. The crown owed the order enormous sums. Negotiations were tense. Trust eroded. The Templars refused to submit to royal oversight, citing papal authority. To Philip, this was no longer acceptable. Elsewhere in Europe, similar tensions brewed. Monarchs resented Templar exemptions from taxes and laws. Local officials bristled at their immunity. Bishops competed with them for influence and donations. Even ordinary people, once grateful for their protection, now saw them as distant and privileged. The Templars' greatest strength, their independence, had become their greatest liability. They were too powerful to ignore, too autonomous to control, and too deeply embedded to dismantle easily. In a medieval world increasingly defined by centralized authority, this made them an anomaly. An anomaly invites correction. As frustration mounted, narratives shifted. The order was no longer described primarily as a shield of Christendom, but as an organization clinging to outdated privileges. Its secrecy, once tolerated as necessary, was recast as suspicious. Its wealth, once justified by war, now appeared excessive. The idea began to circulate that the Templars were not merely obsolete, but dangerous. This shift in perception was subtle but profound. It allowed critics to move beyond questions of purpose and toward questions of legitimacy. If the order no longer served its original mission, then its extraordinary status could be challenged. If its status could be challenged, then its wealth could be reclaimed. But legitimacy required moral grounds. Here, the rumors of heresy found fertile soil. An institution already viewed as out of place was easier to believe corrupt. Accusations that might have been dismissed decades earlier now seemed plausible. The order's isolation worked against it. Few outside its ranks rose to defend it. Inside the Templar hierarchy, awareness of these dangers was uneven. Some leaders recognized the shifting winds and proposed reforms. Others believed their service and history would protect them. There were discussions of merging with other orders, of relocating headquarters, of redefining mission. None came to fruition in time. The world was moving faster than they realized. As crusading zeal faded, pragmatic politics took its place. Kings calculated, weighed risks, and sought advantage. The Templars, once warriors of faith, became pieces on a chessboard. What made their situation especially perilous was the lack of a visible enemy. In the Holy Land, threats were obvious and immediate. In Europe, danger came cloaked in legality and piety. Smiles replaced swords. Negotiations replaced sieges. And while the Templars continued to prepare for wars that might never come, their true battle was already being planned elsewhere. They had returned from the east with their discipline intact but their purpose blurred. They still stood apart, still answered only to Rome, still controlled wealth and land. But the justification that once made this acceptable had vanished with the fall of Acre. In the eyes of Europe's rising monarchs, the question was no longer whether the Templars had served God faithfully. It was whether they were still needed at all. And once that question is asked, the answer rarely favors those who stand alone. The stage was set not for a battlefield clash, but for something far more decisive. A reckoning born of resentment, ambition, and the quiet realization that the age which created the Knights Templar had passed them by. What remained was an order surrounded not by enemies in armor, but by crowned rivals who understood that power, once outdated, becomes a threat simply by continuing to exist. Philip IV of France was not a man given to hesitation. He ruled with a controlled intensity that earned him the name the Fair, not for kindness, but for the cold symmetry of his authority. His court was efficient, his laws uncompromising, his ambition unmistakable. Where earlier kings ruled through feudal loyalty and personal bonds, Philip sought something stronger and more permanent, a centralized state, obedient to the crown alone. But such ambition required money, and France, at the turn of the 14th century, was bleeding. Years of war against England, costly conflicts in Flanders, and the expanding machinery of royal administration had drained the treasury. Philip had debased the currency, expelled Jewish communities to seize assets, and pressured Italian bankers until they fled. Each measure provided temporary relief, but none solved the underlying problem. The kingdom remained heavily indebted. Among Philip's creditors, none loomed larger or more inconvenient than the Knights Templar. The irony was bitter. The order that had once helped stabilize royal finances now embodied everything Philip despised: independence from royal authority, exemption from taxation, and direct allegiance to the Pope. The Templars controlled significant wealth within France, including the Temple in Paris, which functioned as both fortress and financial hub. Royal funds passed through its vaults. State documents were stored behind its walls. In theory, this arrangement was practical. In practice, it was humiliating. A king in debt is a king constrained. Philip understood this acutely. He also understood that the Templars could not be coerced easily. They did not answer to him. Legal pressure was useless. Negotiation had failed. The problem was structural. At the same time, Philip's relationship with the papacy was deteriorating. He had already clashed violently with Pope Boniface VIII over taxation and authority, culminating in the Pope's capture and death. Though Boniface was succeeded by Clement V, a Frenchman, the tension between crown and church remained unresolved. The Templars sat squarely at the intersection of these conflicts. They represented papal authority within French borders. They controlled wealth Philip desperately needed, and they were protected by privileges that challenged his vision of absolute kingship. In Philip's mind, This was not merely an economic problem. It was a question of sovereignty. What followed was not an impulsive decision, but a calculated shift in perspective. The king began to view the Templars not as creditors or allies, but as obstacles. Obstacles could be removed if the right justification could be found. That justification would come wrapped in moral outrage. Philip's advisors began gathering rumors, testimonies, and grievances. Disgruntled former members of the order were questioned. Old accusations were revived. Stories of secret rituals and blasphemous practices were collected, embellished, and refined. The goal was not truth, but plausibility. The strategy was ruthless in its simplicity. If the Templars could be portrayed as heretics, their papal protection would weaken. The Church could not openly defend an order accused of crimes against the faith. Once isolated, the order's assets could be seized in the name of righteousness. It was a dangerous gamble. Accusing a powerful religious order of heresy risked backlash. But Philip was confident. He understood timing. The crusading era had ended. The order's purpose was already in question. Public sentiment had cooled. And most importantly, he controlled the machinery of the French state. The arrests, when they came, would be swift and comprehensive. But long before that moment, the groundwork was laid in silence. Secret investigations, confidants sworn to secrecy, legal frameworks prepared in advance. The king did not move until success was all but guaranteed. What made Philip's plan especially effective was his use of fear. Heresy trials in medieval Europe were not about evidence in the modern sense. They were about confession, and confession could be extracted. Once the first Templar broke under pressure, the narrative would take on a life of its own. The system did the rest. Philip also understood optics. By presenting himself as a defender of orthodoxy, he reframed personal interest as public duty. Any resistance from the order could be portrayed as defiance of both crown and God. Behind the scenes, he applied pressure on Pope Clement V, insisting that the accusations be taken seriously. Clement hesitated, aware of the order's importance and the dangers of royal overreach. But Clement was also a pope without Rome, dependent on French support and wary of repeating his predecessor's fate. Philip's leverage was immense. As rumors intensified, the king moved to control the narrative. Public opinion was carefully managed. Sermons echoed concerns about corruption. Legal scholars were consulted to justify extraordinary measures. By the time the arrests occurred, many in France were already primed to believe the worst. The king's silence before the strike was deliberate. No warning was given. No opportunity for the order to appeal or prepare. This was not justice, it was containment. And yet, there was something almost desperate beneath Philip's confidence. The Templars' wealth, though significant, was not infinite. Seizing it would not solve France's problems forever. What Philip truly sought was not just gold, but control. The elimination of a rival authority. The assertion of royal supremacy over all institutions within his realm. In this sense, the destruction of the Templars was symbolic. It signaled that no power, spiritual or otherwise, could stand beyond the reach of the French crown. The tragedy lies in how effective the strategy proved to be. When the arrests finally came, they shocked Europe not because of their brutality, but because of their suddenness. An order that had seemed untouchable was dismantled in a single night. Its leaders were imprisoned, its members scattered, its reputation destroyed. Philip watched as events unfolded, confident that history would justify him. But history is rarely so generous. While the king achieved his immediate goals, the methods he employed cast a long shadow. The manipulation of faith for political ends. The use of fear as a tool of governance. The silencing of an institution not through reform, but annihilation. In turning against the Knights Templar, Philip the Fair did more than eliminate a creditor. He demonstrated how power, once concentrated, can redefine truth itself. And in doing so, he ensured that the fall of the Templars would never be remembered as a simple act of justice, but as one of the most chilling examples of ambition disguised as piety in medieval history. The orders were written in advance, sealed with wax, and carried by trusted men who did not yet know what they contained. They were instructed to open them only at the appointed hour. This detail mattered. It ensured secrecy, prevented hesitation, and it guaranteed that when the moment arrived, no one, not even the king's own officials, could warn the target. Before dawn on Friday, October 13, 1307, the seals were broken. The commands were precise and merciless. Every Knight Templar within the Kingdom of France was to be arrested simultaneously. Their property was to be seized, their records confiscated. No explanation was to be offered. Resistance was to be crushed. The operation unfolded with a level of coordination rarely seen in medieval governance. As the sky remained dark, royal soldiers moved through cities and villages. Horses' hooves struck stone roads. Torches were lit, casting long shadows against walls marked with the familiar red cross. Doors were forced open. Guards who had stood watch for years in the name of Christ found themselves disarmed and surrounded. Most Templars did not fight back. They were bound by obedience, trained to respect authority, and unprepared for betrayal from within Christendom itself. Many believed, even as they were shackled, that this must be some terrible misunderstanding, one that would be resolved once the Pope was informed. Others sensed something more final in the silence of the night. In Paris, the Temple fortress was taken without a battle. Its massive walls, designed to withstand siege, offered no defense against treachery. The brothers within were arrested, their weapons seized, their rooms searched. Ledgers were taken, chests were broken open. What the soldiers expected to find, vast hoards of gold and silver, was largely absent. The emptiness of the vaults puzzled the king's men. Rumors had painted the temple as a place of unimaginable wealth. Instead, they found records, religious objects, and signs of recent activity, as if preparations had been made in advance. Across the countryside, similar scenes played out. Elderly knights were dragged from beds. Younger ones were bound in chains. Some were beaten. Others were stunned into silence. Very few resisted. By midday, the order that had once spanned continents was paralyzed within France. Then the accusations were announced. The charges were shocking in both scope and severity. The Templars were accused of denying Christ during initiation, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping idols, of engaging in obscene rites, of practicing secret heresies learned in the East. These claims were read aloud as if they were established fact. For many listeners, the shock lay not in the nature of the accusations, but in their suddenness. There had been no public inquiry, no gradual exposure. One day the Templars were defenders of the faith. The next they were its enemies. The psychological effect was devastating. The knights, isolated in prisons, were cut off from one another. They could not coordinate a defense. They could not confirm what others had said or experienced. Each faced interrogation alone, under immense pressure, uncertain whether loyalty or confession would offer any hope of survival. Interrogations began almost immediately. In medieval justice, torture was a legally sanctioned means of extracting truth, particularly in cases of heresy. The assumption was that the innocent would be protected by God, while the guilty would break. Reality was far less divine. Men who had faced battle without flinching found themselves undone by pain inflicted in darkness. Limbs were stretched. Bodies were burned. Sleep was denied. Food withheld. The methods varied, but the goal was the same: confession. And confessions came. Some knights admitted to crimes they barely understood. Others repeated phrases suggested by their interrogators. A few confessed fully, believing that repentance might save their souls even if it cost them their lives. Some retracted their statements as soon as the torture stopped, only to be subjected to it again. The contradictions did not matter. What mattered was that the narrative was now supported by sworn testimony. The king's strategy had worked. The image of the heretical Templar was no longer rumor, it was record. Outside the prisons, the public struggled to reconcile the accusations with memory. These were men known for discipline and piety. Many had lived quietly among local communities. The idea that they had secretly mocked Christ for decades was difficult to accept. But fear has a way of reshaping belief. If the Templars had truly committed such crimes, then their secrecy made sense. Their wealth was suspect, their independence dangerous. The story began to cohere, not because it was true, but because it explained discomfort that had long existed. The Pope, when informed, was furious, not at the Templars but at the king. Clement V had not authorized the arrests. He demanded the prisoners be handed over to church custody. Philip resisted, insisting the matter was too serious to delay. Caught between royal force and papal authority, Clement hesitated. That hesitation was decisive. By the time the Pope acted, the damage was done. Confessions had been extracted. Public opinion had shifted. The idea that the Templars were guilty had taken root. The coordinated nature of the arrests sent a chilling message. No institution, no matter how powerful or sacred, was beyond reach. The king had demonstrated the full extent of his authority, not just over bodies but over narrative. For the Templars, the night of Friday the 13th marked the end of any illusion of security. Their training had prepared them for battle, for martyrdom even, but not for erasure. They had been struck not by swords, but by law. Not by enemies of the faith, but by its self-appointed guardians. As days turned into weeks, and trials replaced interrogations, it became clear that the arrests were not a prelude to justice, but to dissolution. The order would not be reformed. It would be dismantled. Yet even in defeat, questions lingered. Why had the king moved with such urgency? Why had so much of the order's wealth vanished before the arrests? Why did the accusations rely so heavily on coerced testimony? These questions would haunt the proceedings, whispered among skeptics and recorded cautiously by chroniclers. But the machinery of power had already turned. Friday the 13th entered history not merely as a date of superstition, but as a symbol of calculated destruction. A day when an order built over 2 centuries was undone in hours. And in the silence that followed, as prisons filled and reputations burned, one truth became inescapable. Whatever the Knights Templar had been, whatever they had done or not done, they were no longer masters of their fate. History had seized them, and it would not let go. Once the initial shock of the arrests faded, a colder, more methodical phase began. The drama of torchlit seizures gave way to stone chambers, iron restraints, and the slow machinery of medieval justice. What unfolded was not a search for truth, but a process designed to validate a decision already made. The trials of the Knights Templar were unlike ordinary legal proceedings. They were fragmented, uneven, and deeply influenced by the political will of those who controlled them. In theory, accusations of heresy fell under church jurisdiction. In practice, the French crown dominated every stage, from interrogation to imprisonment. The boundary between secular authority and spiritual judgment dissolved. Templars were held in isolation, often in harsh conditions. Many were elderly, weakened by years of warfare or ascetic living. Some were ill. Others were injured during arrest. None were granted the comfort of communal prayer or counsel from their order. Silence was enforced not as discipline but as strategy. Interrogations followed a familiar pattern. Accusers presented a list of charges, many of them vague, some grotesquely specific. The accused were asked to confirm them. When they denied everything, pressure increased. When pressure failed, torture began. The methods were brutal but legal by the standards of the time. Bodies were stretched on racks until joints dislocated. Feet were burned over open flames. Water was forced into lungs. Sleep deprivation blurred memory and reason. Pain was administered not in bursts, but steadily, designed to wear down resistance. Under such conditions, confession became survival. Some knights confessed quickly, believing honesty might bring mercy. Others held out until their bodies failed them. A few never confessed at all and died in their cells, their silence recorded as stubbornness rather than innocence. What emerged from these interrogations was a patchwork of statements that rarely aligned. One knight claimed initiates were told to deny Christ verbally. Another said it was symbolic, a test of obedience. Some spoke of an idol. Others described a head, a skull, or nothing at all. Dates conflicted. Locations shifted. Rituals changed shape with each retelling. In a rational system, such contradictions would have raised alarm. Here they were ignored. The logic was circular and devastatingly effective. If confessions differed, it proved secrecy. If a knight denied everything, it proved deeper guilt. If he recanted a confession, it proved he feared punishment. There was no path to acquittal. Legal representation was virtually non-existent. The accused were often unaware of the specific evidence against them. Witnesses were rarely cross-examined. Documents were withheld. The presumption of guilt hung over every exchange. Yet not all trials unfolded identically. Outside France, where royal pressure was weaker, proceedings were more cautious. In England, Germany, and the Iberian kingdoms, many Templars denied all charges, even under questioning. Torture was used less frequently or not at all. As a result, confessions were scarce. This inconsistency troubled observers. If the order were truly heretical, why did guilt appear so clearly in France and so faintly elsewhere? The answer lay not in theology, but in power. Where Philip's influence reached, confessions flowed. Where it did not, doubt remained. Even within France, some voices resisted. A number of knights, having initially confessed under torture, later recanted publicly, declaring their innocence before assembled councils. These moments were dangerous. Recantation could lead to execution as a relapsed heretic. And some paid that price. Burnings were carried out not only as punishment, but as warning. They demonstrated what awaited those who challenged the narrative. Fear spread through the remaining prisoners. Silence returned. For the Church, the situation was deeply uncomfortable. Pope Clement V attempted to regain control of the process, calling for a general council to decide the order's fate. He insisted that the Templars be judged collectively, not condemned piecemeal. But time worked against him. By the time church-led inquiries convened, the order's reputation was already in ruins. Confessions, however coerced, had been recorded. Public trust had evaporated. Defending the Templars now risked appearing to defend heresy itself. The trials dragged on for years, draining resources and patience. Many knights languished in prison, neither convicted nor acquitted, slowly wasting away. Others were released into monasteries, broken and forgotten. The once mighty order dissolved into scattered, silent individuals. What makes this period especially haunting is the absence of resolution. There was no moment when truth was clearly established. No decisive revelation. Instead, there was exhaustion. The world grew tired of the Templars. Their continued existence became an inconvenience. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, the Pope officially dissolved the order, not by declaring it guilty of heresy, but by suppressing it for the good of the Church. This distinction mattered. It was an admission that proof had been insufficient, but that politics demanded an end. Justice was sacrificed to stability. The order's assets were transferred, largely to the Hospitallers, though much was quietly absorbed by crowns and local powers. The Templars themselves were left without identity or purpose. Some disappeared into obscurity. Others remained under watch for the rest of their lives. For those who had confessed under torture, there was no redemption. Their words had outlived their pain, fixed in record as truth. For those who never confessed, there was no vindication. Silence was all that remained. The trials of the Knights Templar stand as a grim lesson in how systems of justice can be shaped by fear and ambition. They reveal how easily legal process becomes theater when outcomes are predetermined. And they expose a deeper tragedy. These were men trained to accept suffering as duty, obedience as virtue, and silence as strength. Those very qualities were turned against them. Their discipline prevented rebellion. Their faith discouraged resistance. Their trust in authority left them defenseless. In the end, the trials did not uncover a hidden heresy. They revealed something far more unsettling: how quickly a society can abandon its heroes when they no longer serve its needs. The Knights Templar were not destroyed by evidence. They were undone by a world that had decided to move on, and needed a villain to justify the transition. At the center of the unfolding catastrophe stood a man whose silence would shape the fate of the Knights Templar as decisively as any accusation. Pope Clement V was not a tyrant, nor a fanatic. He was cautious, scholarly, and deeply aware of the fragile position he occupied. And it was precisely this awareness that made him hesitate at the moment when clarity was most needed. Clement had not been elected under ordinary circumstances. His papacy began in the shadow of violence, following the humiliation and death of Boniface VIII after a brutal confrontation with the French crown. From the beginning, Clement understood that the balance between papal authority and royal power had shifted. France was no longer merely a Christian kingdom, it was a force capable of bending the Church to its will. When news reached Clement of the mass arrests of the Templars in France, his reaction was not approval but outrage. The king had acted without papal authorization, violating centuries of ecclesiastical precedent. The Templars were directly subject to the Pope. Their arrest by secular authority was an affront to the Church itself. Clement protested. He demanded explanations. He insisted that the prisoners be placed under Church custody. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the papacy might assert itself and halt the process. But that moment passed quickly. Philip IV responded not with defiance, but with pressure. He presented confessions. He emphasized the gravity of the alleged crimes. He framed the arrests not as an act against papal authority, but as a necessary defense of the faith. To oppose the king now would be to appear complicit in heresy. Clement hesitated. He was not convinced of the Templars' guilt. The confessions troubled him, especially their contradictions and the circumstances under which they were obtained. But he was also acutely aware of his vulnerability. The papacy had no army. Its authority depended on cooperation. France was its most powerful ally and potentially its greatest threat. The Pope faced an impossible choice. If he condemned the arrests, he risked provoking a confrontation he could not win. If he defended the Templars, he risked undermining the Church's moral authority should the accusations prove true, or even appear true. And if he delayed, hoping time would clarify matters, events might spiral beyond his control. He chose delay. Clement issued statements calling for careful investigation. He ordered that trials be conducted according to Church law. He convened commissions and councils. But these measures were slow, procedural, and easily overshadowed by the momentum of the king's actions. Meanwhile, the narrative solidified. By the time church-led inquiries began, the Templars had already been condemned in the court of public opinion. Confessions, extracted under torture, circulated widely. Sermons echoed the charges. Doubt became dangerous. Clement's attempts to reassert authority came too late. When he ordered that all Christian rulers arrest Templars in their realms and hand them over to Church custody, it appeared not as a defense, but as confirmation of guilt. The distinction between investigation and condemnation blurred. In other regions, where rulers were less eager than Philip, the response was muted. Some delayed arrests, others conducted mild interrogations. The results varied widely. Many Templars were found innocent or released without charge. This inconsistency should have prompted reconsideration. Instead, it deepened Clement's dilemma. If the order was innocent in some regions and guilty in others, what was the truth? Could heresy be so unevenly distributed? Or was something else at work? The Pope found himself trapped between contradictory evidence and overwhelming pressure. Philip continued to press. He sent envoys to the papal court, armed with testimonies and veiled threats. He hinted at further action if the Church failed to act decisively. The memory of Boniface VIII's fate lingered like a warning. Clement was also facing internal division. Some within the Church believed the Templars had grown too powerful and welcomed their fall. Others defended them fiercely, citing their long service and lack of credible proof. The papacy itself was not unified. In this climate, certainty was elusive. What Clement ultimately did was neither a full defense nor a direct condemnation. It was something far more ambiguous and far more damaging. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, the Pope announced the suppression of the order. He did not declare the Templars guilty of heresy. He acknowledged that proof was insufficient. Yet he argued that the scandal surrounding the order, the damage to the church's reputation, and the impossibility of restoring trust made its continuation untenable. The order was dissolved by way of provision, not judgment. This distinction mattered profoundly, though few recognized it at the time. The Templars were ended not because they had been proven corrupt, but because they had become inconvenient. Clement framed the decision as an act of pastoral care, a sacrifice made to protect the unity of the Church. But the cost was immense. An order that had served Christendom for nearly 2 centuries was erased without a definitive verdict. For the Templars still imprisoned, the decision brought little relief. Some were released into monastic custody. Others remained confined. Their status was uncertain, their futures bleak. There was no restoration of honor, no public apology. Clement's final failure came in his handling of the order's leadership. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, and other senior figures were kept alive for years, their cases unresolved. Clement hesitated again, unwilling to condemn them outright but unwilling to challenge the king's authority. This prolonged limbo would have tragic consequences. The Pope's hesitation, born of fear and calculation, allowed injustice to become permanent. By choosing stability over truth, he ensured that the Templar story would remain unresolved, their legacy forever clouded by suspicion. In the end, Clement V preserved the papacy's immediate safety, but at a lasting moral cost. History remembers him not as a villain, but as a man caught between forces larger than himself. Yet it is often the quiet decisions, the delays, the compromises, the silences, that shape events most profoundly. The Knights Templar were not destroyed by papal decree alone. They were undone by a moment when authority chose caution over courage, and uncertainty was allowed to masquerade as wisdom. And in that hesitation, an entire order slipped beyond rescue. When the royal officials finally breached the strongholds of the Knights Templar, they expected revelation. For years, stories had circulated of unimaginable riches. Gold piled in vaults, sacred relics hidden in stone chambers, treasures carried from Jerusalem itself. The arrests had been justified in part by this belief, that the order's wealth was not only vast, but suspicious. What the king's men found instead was something far more unsettling: absence. Vaults that should have been full were orderly but bare. Chests were present, but empty. Ledgers existed, but many ended abruptly or pointed to transfers already completed. There was no glittering hoard waiting to be seized, no mountain of coin to vindicate the accusations of greed and corruption. The silence of those empty rooms echoed louder than any confession. This disappearance was not easily explained. The Templars had managed enormous resources for decades. They financed crusades, lent to kings, and maintained fortresses across continents. Their wealth was not myth, it was documented, recorded, and relied upon. And yet, at the moment of their destruction, much of it seemed to have vanished. Almost immediately, speculation began. Some believed the treasure had been hidden within France itself, buried beneath Templar estates, or sealed in forgotten tunnels. Others suggested it had been moved abroad, spirited away to sympathetic territories beyond the reach of the French crown. Ports along the Atlantic coast were scrutinized. Stories emerged of ships leaving La Rochelle under cover of darkness just days before the arrests. No official record confirms such an escape. But absence breeds imagination, and imagination quickly turns into legend. What made the mystery more compelling was the sheer scale of coordination required to move such wealth unnoticed. Gold, silver, documents, and valuables cannot simply evaporate. They must be transported, guarded, and stored. This implies foreknowledge, or at least suspicion, that danger was coming. Did the Templars know? The official narrative insists they were caught completely by surprise. Yet the evidence is ambiguous. Some houses showed signs of hurried preparation. Certain documents were missing. Key figures were absent. It was as if parts of the order had gone into motion just before the blade fell. If so, the warning could not have been public. There was no mass flight, no organized resistance. Whatever knowledge existed was likely confined to a small circle, perhaps the leadership, perhaps only those closest to the financial network. And then there is the nature of Templar wealth itself. Unlike a king's treasury, much of the order's riches were not stored as coin. They existed as land, contracts, obligations, and trust. Debts owed to the Templars did not disappear simply because the order fell. But debts are intangible. They cannot be seized by soldiers. When the order was dissolved, many of these assets became the subject of dispute. Officially, much was transferred to the Hospitallers. In practice, a significant portion was quietly absorbed by local authorities or vanished into administrative confusion. Records were lost. Claims overlapped. Opportunism flourished. The chaos benefited many. Yet even accounting for this, the disappearance of liquid wealth remains difficult to explain. Royal accountants expected to find enough to ease France's financial strain. Instead, the crown gained far less than anticipated. Philip IV, for all his planning, did not receive the windfall he may have envisioned. This failure fueled further suspicion. If the treasure was not seized, then someone else must have taken it. And if someone else had taken it, then the order's reach extended beyond its visible collapse. Legends filled the void left by unanswered questions. Some claimed the treasure was hidden to fund a future revival of the order. Others believed it was entrusted to allied groups, waiting for a time when the Templars could return under another name. There were even whispers that the treasure was never primarily material. This idea gained traction in later centuries, when Romanticism and mysticism reshaped the Templar story. According to these interpretations, the true wealth of the order lay in knowledge, maps, teachings, symbols, or truths acquired in the East. Gold could be spent or seized. Knowledge could not. While such claims are impossible to verify, they reflect a deeper unease. The Templars had been systematic, disciplined, and cautious. It is difficult to believe they left their greatest vulnerability unguarded. Still, historians must tread carefully. There is no solid evidence of a single hidden hoard waiting to be discovered. Archaeological searches have yielded nothing conclusive. Many alleged Templar treasures, uncovered over the centuries, have proven to be later constructions or misinterpretations. And yet, the question persists not because of what we have found, but because of what we have not. The disappearance of the treasure became a symbol of the order's unresolved fate. It suggested agency in defeat. It implied that the Templars were not merely passive victims, but actors who took steps, however limited, to preserve something of value. Even among their enemies, this possibility was unsettling. If the order had managed to safeguard its resources, then its destruction was incomplete. Power had been dispersed, not eliminated. The Red Cross might vanish from cloaks, but its influence could persist unseen. This uncertainty haunted the years that followed. Investigations were launched. Properties were searched. Accusations of concealment continued. Nothing definitive emerged. As time passed, the missing treasure became mythologized, folded into broader narratives of secret survival and hidden networks. Each generation reshaped the story to fit its fears and hopes. But behind the legend lies a more sobering reality. The disappearance of the Templar treasure highlights the limits of control, even in moments of apparent victory. Philip IV could arrest men, seize buildings, and dismantle an institution. But he could not fully account for what had moved through its hands for decades. Wealth, like power, is fluid. It changes form. It resists capture. In the end, the empty vaults served as a quiet rebuke to the logic of the trials. If greed had truly driven the order, where was the proof? If corruption had been systemic, why was its most tangible evidence absent? These questions were never answered. They were simply set aside, inconvenient to a narrative already accepted. The vanished treasure became one more silence layered onto many others, a gap in the record that refused to close. And in that gap, the imagination of history continues to wander. Not because treasure is romantic, but because disappearance suggests intention. And intention implies that, even at the moment of their greatest defeat, the Knights Templar may not have been entirely powerless. What they took with them, whether gold, knowledge, or simply the certainty of unanswered questions, ensured that their story would never end cleanly. It would linger, like a locked door with no key left behind. Years passed after the arrests, and the once feared order of the temple faded into a shadow of itself. Most of its members languished in prisons or monasteries, forgotten by a world that had already moved on. Yet one figure remained painfully visible, suspended between life and death, justice and theater. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, had become the living symbol of an order the world was trying to erase. De Molay was not a revolutionary or a mystic. By temperament, he was a traditionalist, loyal to the church, respectful of authority, and convinced that reason would eventually prevail. When the arrests began, he believed the accusations would collapse under scrutiny. He trusted in the order's long service, in papal protection, and in the assumption that truth still mattered. That belief would cost him everything. For nearly 7 years, de Molay remained imprisoned, shuttled between interrogations and delays. He was questioned repeatedly, pressured to confess, urged to cooperate for the sake of peace. At times, broken by suffering, he made limited admissions, carefully worded, ambiguous enough to ease his torment. Like many others, he later recanted, insisting that what he had said under pressure did not reflect truth. This cycle trapped him. Confess and you validate the charges. Recant and you become a relapsed heretic, guilty of a crime punishable by death. The system offered no safe ground. It was designed not to discover truth, but to close the case. By 1314, the fate of the order had already been sealed. The Knights Templar no longer existed in law or name. Their assets had been redistributed, their brothers scattered. What remained was the question of how to dispose of its leadership. On March 18th, Jacques de Molay was brought before a public assembly in Paris, alongside Geoffroy de Charny and other senior figures. The setting was deliberate. This was not a quiet judicial proceeding. It was a spectacle meant to provide closure, to finalize the narrative in the eyes of the people. The cardinals present read out the sentence prepared for the accused. It was harsh but not fatal. Life imprisonment, silence, oblivion. For a moment, it seemed the story would end not with flames, but with disappearance. Then de Molay spoke. Witnesses later described a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The Grand Master, frail from years of confinement but steady in voice, rejected the confessions attributed to him. He declared the order innocent. He proclaimed that the charges were lies, born of fear and greed. He appealed not to kings or popes, but to God. His words shattered the carefully constructed ending. By recanting publicly, de Molay placed himself outside the narrow mercy the court had offered. According to church law, a relapsed heretic could not be spared. The decision was immediate. There would be no further debate, no delay. That same evening, on a small island in the Seine, a stake was prepared. As twilight fell over Paris, crowds gathered. Some came out of curiosity. Others came to witness what they believed was justice. Few understood the weight of what they were about to see. Jacques de Molay was led to the fire without ceremony. There was no grand speech, no plea for mercy. He was bound, surrounded by guards, and positioned above the flames. According to chroniclers, he faced Notre Dame Cathedral as the fire was lit, calling upon God to judge those who had condemned him unjustly. What happened next passed quickly into legend. As the flames rose, de Molay is said to have proclaimed that Pope Clement V and King Philip IV would soon stand before God's tribunal. Within the year, he declared both would be dead. Whether these words were spoken exactly as recorded is impossible to know. Medieval chroniclers often shaped events to fit moral narratives. But the power of the moment did not depend on precise phrasing. It depended on timing. Within weeks, Pope Clement V fell ill and died. Later that same year, Philip IV suffered a sudden fatal stroke. To a medieval audience steeped in belief and symbolism, the sequence was unmistakable. The curse of the last Templar was born. In reality, both deaths had plausible explanations. Clement had been sick for some time. Philip's health was fragile. Yet coincidence has always been fertile ground for meaning, and the deaths cemented de Molay's final act as something more than defiance. It became judgment. The execution marked the emotional climax of the Templar story. An order dismantled not by battlefield defeat, but by accusation. A leader silenced not by proof, but by law. Fire reduced flesh to ash, but it could not erase the questions that lingered in the smoke. For supporters of the crown, the execution closed the chapter. Justice had been served, heresy punished, order restored. For others, it felt like something had gone terribly wrong. The image of an old man burning for crimes never conclusively proven disturbed even those who had accepted the trials. Doubt crept in quietly. If the Templars were truly guilty, why had the end felt so rushed? Why silence the Grand Master at the moment he spoke most clearly? De Molay's death transformed the Templars from a disgraced institution into martyrs of memory. The ambiguity of their guilt became their shield. Where certainty ends, myth begins. Stories spread. Songs were whispered. The Order's destruction was reframed not as purification, but as betrayal. The curse became a metaphor for moral reckoning, a reminder that power exercised without justice invites consequences. In death, Jacques de Molay achieved what years of defense could not. He forced history to hesitate. The execution did not bring resolution. It deepened the mystery. It ensured that the Templars would not be remembered merely as heretics or financiers, but as victims of a process that felt incomplete. Fire consumes, but it also illuminates. As the flames died down on that island in the Seine, the Knights Templar ceased to exist in any official sense. Yet their story, far from ending, entered a new phase, one shaped not by documents and decrees, but by memory, legend, and unanswered questions. The last Grand Master had chosen truth over survival, knowing the cost. And in doing so, he ensured that the Order's final chapter would never be written with certainty, only with doubt, reflection, and the uneasy sense that history had witnessed not justice, but something far more troubling. Because when the smoke cleared, what remained was not proof of guilt. It was silence. And silence, when it follows fire, has a way of echoing far beyond the moment it was created. With the execution of Jacques de Molay, the final public face of the Knights Templar vanished into smoke. Yet death alone was not enough. What followed was something colder, quieter, and in many ways more permanent: the deliberate dismantling of memory itself. The Order was not only destroyed in body, but targeted in history, law, and language, as if erasing its trace could justify what had been done. The papal decree that dissolved the Knights Templar did more than end an institution. It rewrote reality. The Order was no longer to be spoken of as a functioning entity. Its name was stripped of authority. Its symbols were banned, its houses reassigned. In official records, it was as though the Templars had simply ceased to be. Their 2 centuries of service folded into an uncomfortable footnote. This process was systematic. Templar properties were transferred on paper to the Knights Hospitaller. In practice, many never reached them. Local nobles seized lands. Kings absorbed revenues. Churches claimed buildings. In the confusion, opportunism flourished. What had belonged to the Templars became fair game for those with power and proximity. Archives were altered or destroyed. Charters vanished. Correspondence was lost. Some documents were quietly refiled under different names, obscuring origins. Others were burned outright. There was no single order commanding this erasure. It emerged organically from fear, guilt, and convenience. To remember the Templars accurately was dangerous. Former members were forbidden from wearing the Order's insignia. They were reassigned to monasteries or other religious roles, often under strict supervision. Many lived out their days in obscurity, discouraged from speaking about their past. Silence became survival. Even defending the Order carried risk. Clerics who spoke too favorably of the Templars attracted suspicion. Chroniclers learned to soften language, to avoid praise, to frame events carefully. History, after all, was written by those who remained in power. The result was a peculiar absence. For an order that had once spanned continents, protected pilgrims, and financed kings, the surviving record is remarkably thin. There are no grand official histories commissioned in their defense. No authoritative narrative explaining their rise and fall from their own perspective. What remains comes largely from enemies, interrogators, and later commentators trying to make sense of fragments. This absence was not accidental. The Templars represented an uncomfortable truth, that an institution endorsed by the Church, funded by the faithful, and loyal for generations could be dismantled without conclusive proof of guilt. Remembering them clearly risked exposing the fragility of authority. It was safer to forget. In the decades that followed, the name Templar became something to distance oneself from. Successor orders avoided direct association. Their symbols evolved. Their histories were rewritten to emphasize continuity of service without inheriting scandal. The Red Cross faded from prominence. Yet erasure is never complete. Traces linger in architecture, in land records, in unexplained alignments of churches and roads. They persist in local legends, half-remembered stories passed quietly through families whose ancestors had once served the order. In some places, the Templars were remembered not as heretics, but as protectors betrayed. These unofficial memories mattered. They resisted the official silence. They kept questions alive. Why had the order fallen so suddenly? Why were its leaders silenced rather than debated? Why did its destruction feel less like justice and more like removal? As generations passed, the lack of clear answers allowed myth to grow. The erasure created space for imagination. The Templars became whatever later ages needed them to be: guardians of secret knowledge, keepers of lost relics, architects of hidden networks. This was not the intention of those who erased them. They sought closure, not mystery. But by suppressing facts, they invited speculation. By destroying records, they empowered rumor. The attempt to control the narrative backfired, transforming a disgraced order into an enduring enigma. From a historical perspective, the erasure reveals more about medieval power than about the Templars themselves. It shows how authority responds when legitimacy is threatened, not with transparency, but with deletion. It shows that history can be shaped not only by what is recorded, but by what is deliberately left out. The Knights Templar became a cautionary absence. Their disappearance warned other institutions of the limits of independence. It reminded religious orders that papal favor could be withdrawn. It reminded kings that moral narratives could be manufactured, and that doing so carried consequences. But for ordinary people, the erasure felt unsettling. The order had been woven into daily life for generations. Templar houses had provided protection, employment, and stability. Their sudden removal left gaps that were not easily filled. Trust in institutions wavered. If the Templars could fall, who was safe? This quiet anxiety lingered beneath the surface of medieval society. It resurfaced in moments of crisis, in later accusations of heresy, in the suspicion directed toward any group that operated beyond clear control. The Templars became a reference point, a ghost invoked when power seemed to overreach. Ironically, the more thoroughly authorities tried to erase the order, the more resilient its memory became. Because erasure requires consensus, and consensus is fragile when doubt remains. The Knights Templar were not allowed a final word. They were not granted a definitive verdict. Their story ended not with clarity, but with administrative silence. And silence, unlike condemnation, invites return. It invites people to ask what was lost, what was hidden, and what was intentionally forgotten. In that sense, the erasure failed. The order vanished from law, but not from imagination. It disappeared from records, but not from questions. The attempt to wipe the slate clean only highlighted the stain. Centuries later, historians still sift through fragments, trying to reconstruct what was removed. Each missing document, each altered charter, becomes evidence not of guilt, but of unease. The Knights Templar were erased because remembering them clearly was dangerous, and that, more than any charge of heresy or greed, explains why their story refuses to stay buried. History can destroy institutions, cannot so easily destroy doubt. And in the quiet spaces where records end and silence begins, the Templars continue to exist. Not as knights, not as martyrs, but as a reminder that power can remove people from the present, but rarely from memory. What was erased was not just an order. It was certainty. And certainty, once lost, has a way of haunting everything that follows. Officially, the Knights Templar ceased to exist in the early 14th century. Their seals were broken, their houses reassigned, their name forbidden. On parchment and in law, the order was finished. Yet history has a way of resisting clean endings. Almost immediately, quiet questions began to surface. Questions that refused to accept that something so vast, so disciplined, and so interconnected could simply vanish without leaving a living trace. The first hints came not from grand conspiracies, but from small inconsistencies. Not every Templar was arrested. Not every house was searched. Not every brother confessed, disappeared, or died. In some regions, particularly beyond France, former Templars seemed to slip back into society with surprising ease. They joined other religious orders. They served as knights under new banners. They lived quietly on lands that had once belonged to the temple, now rebranded under different names. This was not resurrection in any formal sense. It was adaptation. The Church, aware of the practical value of experienced men, quietly reassigned many former Templars. Their skills, military discipline, administration, logistics were too useful to discard. As individuals, they were absorbed. As an institution, they were denied. Yet this absorption raised an unsettling possibility. If the members survived, could something of the order survive with them? The idea that the Templars continued in secret gained traction in the centuries that followed. Some believed the order went underground, preserving its hierarchy and knowledge beneath a veil of anonymity. Others argued that such continuity was impossible, pointing to the lack of evidence and the dangers of romantic projection. The truth, as often, lies somewhere between. What is undeniable is that the Templars had created systems, financial, organizational, symbolic, that did not depend entirely on public recognition. These systems could be repurposed, diluted, or disguised. They did not require banners or declarations to persist. Consider the fate of Templar properties. Though officially transferred to the Hospitallers, many estates changed hands multiple times. In some cases, the transition was seamless, with the same stewards managing the same lands under a new name. To local communities, little appeared to change. The same faces remained. The same routines continued. In such environments, continuity would have felt natural. Symbols, too, proved resilient. The Red Cross vanished from official use, but variations appeared elsewhere, subtly altered. Architectural motifs associated with Templar churches resurfaced in later constructions. Whether this reflected direct inheritance or broader medieval symbolism is debated, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. Then there are the stories. Across Europe, legends emerged of Templars escaping capture, regrouping in remote regions, or finding refuge with sympathetic rulers. Some tales place them in the mountains, others on islands, others beyond Europe entirely. Most lack credible documentation, yet their persistence suggests a deeper psychological need. People wanted the order to have survived, not because survival was likely, but because erasure felt unjust. The Templars' destruction had been abrupt and ambiguous. Without a clear moral resolution, the story demanded an alternative ending, one where the wronged endured, where justice was deferred rather than denied. Scotland occupies a special place in these narratives. At the time of the arrests, Scotland was under excommunication and hostile to papal authority. King Robert the Bruce had little incentive to enforce orders from Rome or France. According to later tradition, Templars fleeing persecution found sanctuary there, blending into local society or even fighting alongside Scottish forces. There is no contemporary evidence to confirm mass Templar survival in Scotland. Yet the idea persists, strengthened by later associations between Scottish institutions and Templar symbolism. Whether coincidence or continuity, the connection remains tantalizing. Other theories suggest that the order's spirit survived not through knights, but through ideas, that its emphasis on discipline, secrecy, and moral brotherhood influenced later organizations. In this view, the Templars did not need to exist as a named entity to shape the future. This interpretation shifts the focus from survival to legacy. An institution can be destroyed physically, yet its methods and values can be inherited. The Templars had perfected systems of trust, hierarchy, and shared identity. Such systems are portable. They can be adapted to new contexts. From this perspective, the question, did the Templars survive, becomes less literal and more philosophical. Did their structure outlive their name? The lack of direct evidence fuels skepticism. Historians caution against reading continuity into coincidence. Medieval Europe was full of military orders, secretive guilds, and symbolic architecture. Not everything points back to the Templars. Yet skepticism does not erase unease. The disappearance of an institution that once connected kingdoms left gaps that were quietly filled. The financial practices pioneered by the Templars did not vanish. They evolved. The administrative techniques they refined were adopted by states and churches. The idea of a transnational organization bound by shared purpose survived in other forms. In this sense, the Templars did not need to hide in shadows to endure. They had already changed the world. Still, the allure of secret survival remains powerful. It speaks to a broader human instinct, the belief that truth, once suppressed, finds a way to persist. That justice, delayed, does not disappear. That something meaningful does not simply end because authority declares it so. The Templars embodied ideals that resonated deeply: devotion, sacrifice, loyalty to a cause beyond the self. Their destruction did not discredit these ideals. If anything, it elevated them. For those who believed the order had been wronged, survival stories offered comfort. They suggested that the Templars' mission continued, even if unseen. That the Red Cross, though outlawed, still marked invisible bonds. Whether this was reality or myth is ultimately less important than what it reveals. The Knights Templar left a vacuum, a space where certainty should have been. Into that space rushed questions, hopes, and interpretations. Survival narratives filled the emotional gap left by erasure. History rarely offers clean conclusions. The official record insists the Templars ended in disgrace. Popular memory refuses to accept that ending. Between these positions lies a gray area where fragments persist, where continuity blurs, and where the line between survival and influence becomes indistinct. Perhaps the order did not survive as an organization, but perhaps it did not need to, because survival is not always about names or structures. Sometimes it is about imprint, about leaving behind ways of thinking, organizing, and believing that continue to shape the world long after the original form is gone. In that sense, the Knights Templar may have achieved something rare. They became too embedded in history to be completely erased. And when something cannot be erased, it is never truly dead. It waits quietly, in the spaces where certainty fails, reminding us that endings declared by power are not always the endings history remembers. While much of Europe complied, willingly or reluctantly, with papal orders to arrest former Knights Templar, one land stood apart in a state of open defiance. Scotland, fractured by war and excommunication, existed beyond the reach of Rome's immediate authority. It was here, on the rugged edges of medieval Christendom, that one of the most enduring and controversial strands of the Templar story took root. At the time of the Templars' downfall, Scotland was locked in a bitter struggle for independence. King Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope, declared an enemy of the Church for his defiance of English-backed papal authority. To Bruce, Rome was not a moral compass but a political instrument aligned against his survival. This mattered. When papal commands went out across Europe ordering the arrest and interrogation of all Templars, Scotland was under no obligation to obey. There was no incentive to cooperate with a church that had already condemned its king. In this vacuum of authority, rumor and possibility found fertile ground. According to later tradition, Templars fleeing persecution crossed into Scotland seeking refuge. They were trained warriors, experienced administrators, and men accustomed to secrecy. Scotland, torn by war and desperate for skilled fighters, would have been a natural destination. There are no surviving royal decrees welcoming them, no charters explicitly granting sanctuary. But absence of evidence does not equal absence of action, especially in a land at war, where survival often took precedence over record-keeping. The legends grow stronger when tied to one particular event. In 1314, 7 years after the mass arrests in France and just weeks after the execution of Jacques de Molay, Robert the Bruce faced the English army at Bannockburn. The battle would determine Scotland's future. Against overwhelming odds, the Scots achieved a stunning victory. Later stories claim that a mysterious group of heavily armored knights joined the battle at a critical moment, turning the tide. These warriors bore no heraldry and disappeared as suddenly as they arrived. In some versions of the tale, they were identified as former Templars, fighting not for Rome, but for a king who stood outside its authority. Modern historians are rightly skeptical. Contemporary accounts of Bannockburn make no mention of such knights. Medieval chroniclers, often eager to embellish victories with divine intervention, remained silent on this point. And yet, the story persists. It persists because it fits emotionally, if not evidentially. It offers a sense of poetic justice. The betrayed order finding purpose again, not in service of a distant church, but in defense of a people resisting domination. It transforms exile into redemption. Beyond Bannockburn, Scotland's landscape itself seems to invite speculation. Remote valleys, rugged coastlines, and isolated islands offered countless places to disappear. Unlike France, where royal administration was tightening its grip, Scotland's fractured authority made anonymity possible. Templars seeking to vanish would not need to rebuild the order. They would need only to blend in. And blend in they could. Many knights had Scottish origins. Others shared cultural and martial traditions that aligned easily with local clans. Over time, distinction would blur. A former Templar would simply become another knight, another landholder, another name in a genealogy that no longer spoke of the Red Cross. Some point to architectural clues as evidence of continuity. Certain Scottish churches and chapels display symbolic features reminiscent of Templar design. Round naves, carved heads, unusual geometric patterns. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century, has become a focal point for such theories. Its carvings, dense with symbolism, have inspired generations of interpretation. Some see Templar influence, others see Masonic tradition. Still others argue it reflects the creative excess of medieval stonework rather than secret inheritance. What matters is not whether Rosslyn Chapel proves Templar survival. It matters that people look there at all. The Scottish Templar narrative gained strength in later centuries, particularly during periods when secrecy and brotherhood captured the imagination. As Freemasonry developed and traced its symbolic lineage backward, the Templars became a compelling ancestral figure, warrior monks wronged by power, guardians of lost wisdom. Scotland, already central to Masonic origin stories, became the perfect stage. But this retroactive symbolism complicates historical truth. Later movements projected their values backward, reshaping medieval figures to fit modern needs. The danger lies in mistaking resonance for reality. Still, even stripped of legend, Scotland represents something real in the Templar story. It represents a place where authority failed to reach completely, where obedience was not guaranteed, where alternative outcomes were possible. That alone sets it apart. In France, the Templars were trapped by centralized power. In Scotland, power was contested. That difference created space, not necessarily for an order to survive intact, but for individuals to escape total erasure. And individuals matter. History often focuses on institutions, but institutions are built from people. A former Templar who lived quietly in Scotland, married, managed land, taught skills, or passed on values would leave no dramatic trace. Yet his influence would ripple outward, indistinguishable from the fabric of local life. This is the most plausible form of survival. Not secret armies or hidden hierarchies, but diffusion. The order dissolved, but its members did not vanish into thin air. They carried with them habits of discipline, methods of organization, and a worldview shaped by loyalty and secrecy. These traits did not disappear when the Red Cross was stripped away. They simply changed context. Scotland's role in the Templar mystery endures because it resists closure. It offers a counter-narrative to total annihilation. It suggests that history's margins matter, that what happens beyond the reach of centralized power can shape legacies in quiet, unrecorded ways. Whether or not Templars fought at Bannockburn, whether or not they found formal sanctuary, Scotland symbolizes the possibility that the Order's end was not uniform everywhere. Some doors closed, others may have been left ajar. In the end, the Scottish connection tells us less about secret armies and more about human resilience, about the ways people adapt when institutions collapse, about how identity can survive without banners or names. The Knights Templar may not have risen again in Scotland as an order, but Scotland reminds us that history does not end where documents stop. Sometimes it continues in silence, carried by individuals who step out of legend and into ordinary life, leaving behind no proof, only possibility. And possibility, once planted, has a way of refusing to die. As centuries passed and the dust of medieval politics settled, a new mystery began to take shape, one not born from trials or executions, but from symbols, rituals, and whispered continuities. It was here that the Knights Templar began to reappear in an unexpected form, not as armored monks, but as shadows behind one of the modern world's most enigmatic brotherhoods, Freemasonry. The connection did not emerge in the Middle Ages. It surfaced much later, when men began looking backward, searching for origins that carried both legitimacy and romance. Freemasonry, formalized in the 17th and 18th centuries, presented itself as an ancient tradition rooted in moral improvement, secrecy, and symbolic knowledge. Almost immediately, questions followed. Where had these rituals come from? Who were the first brothers? What lineage did they claim? Into that uncertainty stepped the Templars. The appeal was obvious. The Knights Templar embodied everything later secret societies admired: discipline, hierarchy, initiation, symbols layered with meaning, and a dramatic martyrdom at the hands of power. They were an order destroyed, not defeated, making them ideal ancestors for a movement that defined itself as quiet, enduring, and misunderstood. Some Masonic rites began to incorporate Templar imagery explicitly. Degrees appeared that referenced the Temple of Solomon, the loss of sacred knowledge, and the death of a just brother betrayed by corruption. The language was symbolic, not historical, but symbolism has its own persuasive power. To many, it felt like continuity. According to one popular theory, surviving Templars found refuge in regions beyond papal reach, Scotland most often, and passed their traditions into early Masonic lodges. Over time, the warrior element faded, replaced by allegory. Swords became symbols. Fortresses became lodges. Oaths remained. It is a compelling story, but historians urge caution. There is no direct documentary evidence linking medieval Templars to early Freemasons. The gap in time alone is significant. The Templars were dissolved in the early 14th century. Organized Freemasonry emerged centuries later. Records from the intervening period do not establish a clear chain of transmission. Yet absence of proof does not end the conversation. Because the question is not only whether the Templars survived as an organization, but whether their ideas survived, absorbed, transformed, and repurposed by later groups searching for meaning. Freemasonry drew heavily on the symbolism of building: stone, light, geometry, the Temple of Solomon. These themes were already central to the Templars' identity. The temple was not just a place, it was an idea. Order imposed on chaos. Structure infused with divine purpose. In this shared symbolic language, some see coincidence. Others see inheritance. The Templars' emphasis on brotherhood, secrecy, and moral testing resonates strongly with Masonic values. Both systems used initiation rituals to mark transformation. Both emphasized loyalty to a higher principle rather than to kings or governments. Both cultivated an inner circle of trust. These parallels are undeniable, but parallels do not require direct descent. Medieval Europe was rich in symbolic traditions. Guilds, monastic orders, and knightly fraternities all employed ritual and allegory. Freemasonry could have drawn from this shared cultural reservoir without inheriting anything specifically Templar. And yet, the Templars stand apart. Their destruction left a wound in the historical imagination. They were an order that seemed to possess something: power, knowledge, independence that others lacked. Their sudden fall demanded explanation. Freemasonry, with its silence and symbolism, offered a vessel into which unanswered questions could flow. Some Masonic traditions leaned into this association deliberately. By claiming Templar ancestry, they aligned themselves with a narrative of injustice and survival. They became heirs not to guilt, but to persecution. The Templars' martyrdom reframed secrecy as virtue. This was not deception. It was myth-making, and myth-making plays a powerful role in shaping identity. Within certain Masonic rites, the Templar is not a historical figure but an archetype. The faithful brother betrayed by corruption, killed for refusing to abandon truth, and preserved through memory rather than institution. This is not history, it is moral storytelling. Still, critics argue that such symbolism risks blurring fact and fantasy. By projecting continuity where none can be proven, later movements may distort medieval reality. The danger is not belief, but certainty built on desire rather than evidence. Yet even critics acknowledge something important. The Templars' influence did not end with their dissolution. Their story reshaped how later societies thought about secrecy, authority, and moral resistance. Freemasonry emerged in a world increasingly suspicious of centralized power. The idea of a brotherhood bound by shared values rather than coercion resonated deeply. In that sense, the Templars did not need to survive physically to inspire continuity. They survived conceptually. The link between Templars and Masons says as much about modern needs as medieval facts. In times of upheaval, people look backward for anchors. They seek narratives that validate quiet endurance over loud domination. The Templars offered that narrative. And Freemasonry, in turn, provided a structure where such a narrative could live. This does not mean Freemasons are secret Templars, or that medieval knights pass down hidden teachings unchanged. It means that history's unresolved stories tend to migrate into new forms. They find expression where symbolism thrives. What began as accusation became allegory. What was once suppressed became encoded. The real continuity, if it exists, lies not in documents or bloodlines, but in questions. The same questions that haunted the fall of the Templars reappear in Masonic philosophy. What is truth? Who has the right to define it? How should a moral individual respond to unjust authority? These are not medieval questions. They are timeless. In this way, the Templar-Masonic connection endures not because it can be proven, but because it feels meaningful. It offers a framework for understanding how ideals survive destruction, not by resisting openly, but by adapting quietly. And perhaps that is the most Templar idea of all. An order that once believed in obedience and silence may have left behind not a lineage, but a lesson. That power fades, institutions fall, but symbols endure, waiting for those who know how to read them. Whether Freemasonry inherited the Templars' secrets or simply their shadow, the connection reveals something profound about history itself. When certainty is erased, meaning does not disappear, transforms. And in that transformation, the Knights Templar continue to walk, not as warriors in armor, but as echoes in ritual, allegory, and the enduring human need to believe that truth, once silenced, finds another voice. Few legends have followed the Knights Templar as persistently, or as seductively, as that of the Holy Grail. Over time, the two became inseparable in the public imagination, bound together by mystery, secrecy, and the promise of a truth hidden just beyond reach. Yet the Grail of the Templars was never a simple object, and its meaning shifted dramatically as centuries passed. In its earliest Christian form, the Holy Grail was imagined as a cup, a vessel used by Christ at the Last Supper, later said to have caught his blood at the crucifixion. It symbolized sacrifice, redemption, and divine grace. But this was not the Grail that attached itself to the Templars. That transformation came later, through poetry, allegory, and longing. Medieval writers like Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach reshaped the Grail into something more elusive. In their stories, it was no longer merely a relic but a test. Only the pure could approach it. Only the worthy could understand it. The Grail became a mirror of the seeker's soul. It is no coincidence that these stories emerged in the same cultural atmosphere that elevated the Knights Templar. The Grail legends reflected the anxieties and aspirations of an age obsessed with hidden holiness and corrupted authority. They asked a dangerous question: what if divine truth was not controlled by the Church alone? Into this symbolic space stepped the Templars. As an order sworn to secrecy, discipline, and spiritual purpose, they fit naturally into the Grail narrative. They were imagined not as seekers, but as guardians. Knights who had already found the Grail or something like it, and were sworn to protect it from a world unworthy of its power. But what exactly was this Grail? Over time, interpretations multiplied. Some claimed it was a physical relic, hidden away after the fall of Jerusalem. Others believed it was not a cup at all, but a stone, a book, or a symbol. Each generation reimagined it to fit its own questions. One of the most provocative interpretations reframed the Grail not as an object, but as bloodline. According to this theory, the Grail was the lineage of Christ himself. His descendants preserved in secret, protected from persecution by those who understood the threat such a truth posed to institutional religion. In this version, the Templars were not relic hunters, but guardians of living history. There is no historical evidence to support this claim, and yet its appeal is revealing. The bloodline theory emerged not from medieval sources, but from modern discomfort with absolute authority. It challenges the idea that divine legitimacy flows only through institutions. It suggests that truth can survive outside doctrine, carried quietly through generations. Whether true or not, this reinterpretation tells us something important. The Grail had become a metaphor for forbidden truth. Another interpretation frames the Grail as knowledge itself. Ancient wisdom, lost texts, or spiritual insights suppressed by orthodoxy. In this view, the Templars' alleged discoveries beneath the Temple Mount fed directly into the legend. The Grail was not something to drink from, it was something to know. Knowledge, after all, has always been dangerous. Throughout history, those who claimed access to deeper understanding often found themselves accused of heresy. The Grail, reimagined as hidden wisdom, aligns perfectly with the accusations later leveled against the Templars. Secret rituals, forbidden ideas, truths too destabilizing to reveal. Seen this way, the Grail legend becomes less about fantasy and more about power. Who controls meaning? Who decides what is sacred? Who is allowed to know? The Templars, whether intentionally or not, became symbols of resistance to centralized spiritual authority. Their independence, their silence, and their sudden destruction reinforced the idea that they had possessed something others feared. Even if they did not, the Grail also functioned as a moral ideal. In the legends, it could not be seized by force. It revealed itself only to those who were pure of heart. This idea resonated deeply in a world where brute power often triumphed over virtue. By associating the Templars with the Grail, storytellers recast them as tragic figures, warriors bound by violence, yet striving for transcendence. Men caught between earthly conflict and divine aspiration. This duality mirrors the order itself. They were knights sworn to kill, yet monks sworn to humility. Their lives embodied contradiction. The Grail, as an unattainable ideal, reflected that tension perfectly. After the Order's fall, the Grail legend intensified. With the Templars gone, the question shifted. If they had guarded the Grail, where was it now? Had it been lost, hidden, passed on, or had it never existed at all? The absence of answers only strengthened the myth. In later centuries, writers and mystics expanded the Grail's meaning even further. It became a symbol of inner transformation. The journey mattered more than the destination. The Grail was enlightenment, wholeness, union with the divine. In this interpretation, the Templars' failure was not in losing the Grail, but in being destroyed by a world unready for what it represented. This version of the Grail is not something that can be confiscated. It survives collapse. That may be why the legend refuses to fade. The Grail adapts because it was never meant to be fixed. It evolves with the needs of those who seek it. For medieval audiences, it expressed longing for holiness in a corrupt world. For modern ones, it represents suppressed truth and spiritual autonomy. In every age, it reflects dissatisfaction with existing authority. And the Templars, bound to the Grail in myth, become avatars of that dissatisfaction. Not because they were perfect, but because they were silenced. In the end, the Grail reimagined tells us less about what the Templars possessed, and more about what humanity fears losing. Meaning, truth, purpose beyond control. Whether the Grail was a cup, a bloodline, a book, or an idea no longer matters. What matters is that it became a vessel for doubt. And doubt is the one thing power has never been able to fully destroy. The Knights Templar did not need to guard a literal Grail to earn their place in its legend. Their story itself became the Grail, a reminder that somewhere between faith and authority, between obedience and truth, lies something precious that cannot be owned, only sought, and perhaps never fully found. Among the many legends that grew in the long shadow of the Knights Templar, few are as controversial, or as quietly persistent, as the claim that they knew of lands beyond Europe long before such knowledge was supposed to exist. These stories do not speak of armies or relics, but of maps, coastlines, and a world larger than medieval minds were meant to imagine. At the heart of these theories lies a simple, unsettling question. How did certain maps appear to depict places that Europeans officially discovered centuries later? Medieval portolan charts are marvels of precision. Their coastlines are accurate to a degree that still surprises historians. They show harbors, currents, and navigation routes with remarkable clarity. Yet some of these maps contain features that seem anachronistic. Landmasses that resemble the Americas, Antarctica without ice, or islands placed with improbable accuracy. Mainstream scholarship explains these anomalies cautiously. Some are coincidences. Others are distortions or misinterpretations by later viewers projecting modern shapes onto medieval drawings. Still others may represent lost or poorly understood islands, not continents. But for those drawn to the Templar mystery, another explanation presents itself. The Knights Templar were not isolated monks. They were international operators. They controlled ports, ships, and trade routes. They interacted with Muslim navigators, Jewish scholars, and Byzantine cartographers, cultures with advanced knowledge of astronomy and geography. They moved between worlds that did not always share their knowledge openly. In the Mediterranean, information traveled with merchants and sailors. Maps were prized commodities, guarded as secrets rather than published as books. Knowledge of currents, winds, and coastlines could mean the difference between fortune and ruin. It is not impossible that the Templars encountered geographic information unknown to most of Europe. The question is whether that information extended beyond the known world. One of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence in this debate is the so-called Piri-Reis map, created in the early 16th century. Though produced long after the Templars' dissolution, its maker claimed it was based on much older sources. Some researchers argue that those sources included ancient or medieval maps depicting the Americas. The map's origins remain contested, but the fascination persists because it points to a larger idea: that knowledge can be lost, suppressed, or forgotten. The Templars, accused of guarding secrets and moving resources invisibly, fit neatly into this narrative. If anyone could have possessed maps ahead of their time, it would have been an order that operated beyond borders and beneath scrutiny. Another element often cited is the Templars' maritime presence. Though best known as land-based warriors, the Templars controlled fleets, particularly in the later years of the order. They operated ports like La Rochelle, one of France's most important Atlantic harbors. They transported pilgrims, goods, and possibly people across vast distances. When the arrests came in 1307, ships are said to have vanished from Templar ports. No record details where they went. This absence fuels speculation. Some suggest the ships carried treasure. Others propose they carried people. A more radical theory claims they carried knowledge and sailed far beyond familiar routes. Again, evidence is thin, but speculation thrives where records fail. The Atlantic world, before Columbus, was not entirely unknown. Norse explorers had reached North America centuries earlier. Fishing routes extended far into open waters. Islands like the Azores and Canaries were known or rumored. The idea that medieval sailors might have ventured farther is not absurd. What makes the Templar theory compelling is not proof, but plausibility combined with silence. If the Templars had encountered lands across the Atlantic, they would have had little incentive to publicize the fact. Knowledge of new trade routes could shift power dramatically. Keeping such information within a trusted network would make sense. But here lies the crucial problem. The order was destroyed. If such knowledge existed, it would have had to survive in fragments. Maps passed quietly, traditions encoded, hints preserved without explanation. Over time, these fragments could be misunderstood, misattributed, or lost entirely. This would explain why no clear Templar map of the Americas exists, yet hints appear later out of context. Skeptics argue this is a classic case of retrofitting mystery to fill gaps. Humans are pattern-seeking. We connect dots that may not belong together. The Templars become a convenient vessel for unexplained anomalies. And skeptics are right to be cautious. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. The Templars leaving Europe and mapping the Americas remains unproven. But the enduring fascination reveals something deeper. These theories emerge not because we want to believe medieval knights discovered America, but because we are uncomfortable with how rigid historical timelines can feel. The idea that knowledge progresses neatly, step by step, controlled by institutions, does not align with the messy reality of human history. Knowledge moves in bursts. It is gained, lost, rediscovered. The Templars symbolized that instability. They were an institution accused of knowing too much, of operating beyond accepted limits. The idea that they possessed maps that shouldn't exist is less about geography and more about forbidden awareness. What if the world was always larger than authorities admitted? What if discovery is not always discovery, but rediscovery? Even if the Templars never crossed the Atlantic, they lived in a world where knowledge circulated unevenly. Islamic scholars preserved ancient Greek geography. Chinese explorers mapped vast regions unknown to Europe. Information flowed through translation, trade, and conquest. Europe's later age of discovery was not a beginning, it was a convergence. The Templars, positioned at cultural crossroads, may have encountered pieces of that convergence earlier than most. They may have understood, even vaguely, that the world extended beyond the horizons drawn on European maps. That understanding alone would have been powerful and dangerous, because maps do more than show land. They challenge authority. They redraw boundaries of possibility. They undermine narratives of central control. They invite people to imagine alternatives. Whether the Templars held literal maps of unknown continents or simply embodied the fear of uncontrolled knowledge, the effect is the same. They became associated with horizons beyond permission. The idea of forbidden maps endures because it reflects a timeless tension between what is known and what is allowed to be known. The Knights Templar in life and legend occupy that space, not because they proved the world was larger, but because their story reminds us that history often hides its uncertainties behind official conclusions. And sometimes the most dangerous knowledge is not that something exists, but that it could. That possibility, like an uncharted coastline, remains just out of sight, waiting. By the time the Knights Templar had been destroyed as an organization and their leaders executed, the world had already begun to forget their ordinary functions. Castles were repurposed, estates were redistributed, and former brothers assimilated into new institutions. Yet the deeper mysteries, the silences left in their wake, refused to disappear. These gaps became the fertile ground for conspiracy, speculation, and the enduring sense that something essential had been lost or deliberately hidden. Over time, the Templars were no longer remembered simply as knights or monks. They became symbols of secrecy, of forbidden knowledge, and of power that could not be fully controlled. The narrative of conspiracy surrounding the Templars is rooted in both their real history and the ambiguities of their destruction. They were an international organization with resources, autonomy, and influence unprecedented in medieval Europe. Their rapid fall, orchestrated primarily by Philip IV of France with tacit papal compliance, seemed sudden and inexplicable to contemporary observers. How could an institution so powerful, so disciplined, and so deeply entrenched in both the spiritual and temporal worlds be undone almost overnight? The answer, for many, seemed too convenient, too complete, and therefore suspect. Stories proliferated of hidden treasures, secret archives, and sacred objects spirited away just before the arrests. Chroniclers recorded that the Templars had anticipated danger, perhaps even for decades, and had taken steps to protect whatever was most valuable, whether material wealth, knowledge, or relics. These rumors were amplified by the fact that when French forces searched Templar properties, the expected riches were largely absent. Vaults that should have contained gold, silver, and relics were empty. Ledgers indicated transactions completed just before the purge. Ships were said to have sailed under cover of darkness. This conspicuous absence created the impression that the order had not been caught unprepared but had intentionally concealed something. Speculation intensified as the Templars' knowledge of geography, finance, and logistics became a point of fascination. They had managed a form of banking decades before modern institutions, facilitated transcontinental trade, and established networks that spanned Europe and the Holy Land. That level of coordination suggested to some that they may have also possessed knowledge inaccessible to ordinary rulers or clergy, including maps, routes, or understanding of lands beyond Europe. The idea that they could have hidden such information fed into conspiracy theories that grew steadily over the following centuries. One persistent theme in Templar conspiracies is the notion that the order preserved or guarded forbidden knowledge. This knowledge, the stories suggest, was so dangerous or destabilizing that it could not be left in ordinary hands. Some theories claim it was religious in nature, a deeper understanding of Christian doctrine or sacred relics. Others suggest it was practical knowledge, secrets of navigation, trade, or military strategy that could give its holders unprecedented power. The allure of such claims is psychological. The Templars' disappearance left a vacuum, and humans have a natural tendency to fill gaps in understanding with narrative, particularly when those gaps involve wealth, secrecy, or sudden, unexplained loss of power. The survival of former Templars in regions beyond France also fueled the conspiracy narrative. Scotland, Portugal, and parts of Spain are frequently cited as places where exiled knights found refuge, often blending into local societies or joining other orders. In Scotland, the connection is particularly strong, intertwined with legends surrounding King Robert the Bruce and later symbolic associations with Freemasonry. The idea that the Templars may have carried their knowledge, relics, or resources into new territories, remaining unseen but influential, provides fertile ground for speculation. Even if most of these claims cannot be verified historically, they persist because they satisfy the psychological need for continuity and agency in a story defined by abrupt loss. By the early modern period, conspiracies began to intertwine with symbolic reinterpretation. Authors and mystics recast the Templars as guardians of secret wisdom, linking them to legendary objects such as the Holy Grail, lost Ark of the Covenant, or arcane knowledge of ancient civilizations. The narrative shifted from simple treasure hunting to guardianship of profound truths. The disappearance of these truths alongside the order's eradication became emblematic of human curiosity and authorities' attempts to suppress it. Conspiracy, in this context, is not just suspicion of hidden wealth, but suspicion of concealed power, the kind that cannot be explained by ordinary historical events. Some conspiracy theories also highlight timing and method. The precision of the 1307 arrests, executed simultaneously across France, combined with the apparent prior removal of valuables, suggests foresight that ordinary medieval institutions would struggle to organize. Whether or not the Templars anticipated the purge in advance is unknowable, but the perception of coordination feeds the idea that their collapse was not total, that fragments may have survived to carry on the order's mission covertly. This perception is reinforced by the absence of a clear moral or judicial resolution. Pope Clement V's dissolution of the order did not declare guilt definitively, creating space for doubt and alternative interpretations. Another recurring element of conspiracy narratives is the Templars' supposed influence on secret societies that emerged centuries later. Freemasonry is often cited as a descendant or inheritor of Templar ideals, symbols, and moral frameworks. While direct historical evidence is scarce, the symbolic continuity is compelling. Both emphasize secrecy, ritual, hierarchical structure, and moral responsibility. The narrative that Templar knowledge, treasures, or wisdom survived in hidden societies appeals to those who seek continuity between past and present, suggesting that the Order's disappearance was superficial while its influence endured. The combination of sudden destruction, vanished assets, and enduring influence creates a psychological pattern that fuels conspiracy. Humans are naturally inclined to perceive intention behind outcomes that seem too neat, too complete, or too symbolic. In the case of the Templars, the disappearance of an entire institution, its leaders executed, and its assets dispersed, produces the sense that something larger, perhaps profoundly consequential, was deliberately concealed. Conspiracies flourish where authority suppresses evidence, where complexity is reduced to narrative, and where silence replaces explanation. This enduring fascination also reflects on the broader relationship between power and secrecy. The Templars themselves operated in a world where discretion was critical. Their military, financial, and religious operations required confidentiality. Their vows, rules, and practices emphasized obedience and silence. In many ways, their secretive nature was entirely practical. Yet, after their dissolution, the very secrecy that once protected them became the seed for suspicion. An organization accustomed to concealment is naturally read as having hidden agendas once it disappears abruptly. The conspiracy narrative is further amplified by the human need for narrative closure. The Templars' destruction was messy, incomplete, and morally ambiguous. Many died under torture or execution without due process. Confessions were extracted under duress. Records were destroyed or altered. Assets vanished. These gaps leave unanswered questions that people instinctively seek to fill. Conspiracy provides a framework that resolves ambiguity. Hidden knowledge explains sudden downfall, coordinated preservation explains missing wealth, and secret survival explains inconsistencies. Even modern popular culture reflects this tendency. Novels, films, and speculative histories frequently portray the Templars as guardians of hidden truths or ancient technology. While fictional, these portrayals are deeply influenced by historical gaps and the evocative nature of the Order's abrupt end. The interplay of historical fact, rumor, and narrative imagination ensures that the Templars remain emblematic of conspiracy, secrecy, and suppressed knowledge, an enduring psychological archetype as much as a historical reality. Ultimately, the conspiracy surrounding the Knights Templar endures because it fills a void left by history itself. The Order's sudden eradication, combined with its extraordinary power, discipline, and secrecy, creates a pattern that invites interpretation. The truth of the Templars' knowledge, wealth, or influence may never be known. But the stories that arise from absence, the myths and suspicions that continue to circulate, reveal something profound about human perception. When an institution vanishes, people instinctively search for reasons beyond the visible, crafting explanations that satisfy the mind's need for order, meaning, and mystery. In the end, the conspiracies of the Templars are not simply about gold, relics, or maps. They are about the enduring tension between knowledge and authority, secrecy and revelation, disappearance and memory. They are as much a reflection of those who seek to understand the past as they are of the Order itself. And because these gaps in certainty will never be fully closed, the Templars will always inhabit the shadowed space where history, legend, and imagination intersect. By the time the dust settled on the trials, executions, and dissolution of the Knights Templar, the physical order had ceased to exist, but its story refused to fade. Across Europe, the remnants of the Order, its buildings, its lands, its wealth were redistributed, absorbed into other institutions, or quietly claimed by ambitious rulers. Yet the Templars' legacy endured in ways far more subtle and enduring than legal documents or property records could ever capture. They had left behind a pattern, a combination of discipline, secrecy, and extraordinary organizational skill that fascinated generations long after their disappearance. This pattern became the foundation for speculation, myth, and the enduring idea that the Order had never truly vanished. The years following their destruction were a time of uneasy memory. In France, Philip Ivy's seizure of Templar assets gave the appearance of victory, yet it failed to provide clarity or moral closure. The arrests had been meticulous, but the anticipated wealth had largely disappeared, fueling questions that could not be answered. Records had been destroyed or hidden. Witnesses and former members were scattered. The official papal decree of 1312 dissolved the order without declaring guilt. From a historical perspective, the Templars' destruction was effective in the legal and institutional sense, but incomplete in cultural memory. This incompleteness left a vacuum that imagination could and did fill. People began to wonder what the Templars had known that made them so dangerous, what treasures or knowledge they had moved out of reach before the Purge, and how an order with such extensive international networks had seemingly disappeared overnight. The suddenness of their downfall created fertile ground for myths. Every empty vault, every missing document, every unexplained disappearance of individuals contributed to the sense that the Templars had been guardians of secrets too powerful to be left exposed. One of the most persistent strands of speculation centers on the idea that the Templars did not entirely disappear, but survived covertly in secret networks. This is not to suggest that the medieval order continued intact, but rather that its surviving members may have integrated into other organizations or influenced emerging societies, carrying with them skills, knowledge, and symbolic practices that were adapted to new contexts. Such claims are particularly strong in regions beyond the reach of the French crown, including Scotland, Portugal, and parts of Spain, where political autonomy and distance from papal authority could have allowed former Templars to operate discreetly. In Scotland, for example, legends link the Templars to King Robert the Bruce and the battles for Scottish independence. The country was excommunicated at the time and largely insulated from papal enforcement. Stories claim that fleeing Templars aided the Scots militarily or sought refuge with sympathetic nobles. While these tales cannot be verified, they highlight a recurring theme. The Templars' disappearance was never total in popular imagination, and wherever power was fragmented, survival seemed plausible. Even if their influence was subtle, it suggests that the order's operational knowledge, logistics, administration, and disciplined hierarchy could persist beyond the legal end of the organization. Another strand of enduring Templar influence appears in symbolic and ritual traditions. Centuries later, Freemasonry would emerge, claiming philosophical and moral lineage that many interpreters link to the Templars. Both the order and the early Masons emphasized secrecy, initiation, hierarchy, and moral discipline. Freemasonry incorporated symbols associated with the Temple of Solomon, geometric patterns, and allegorical teachings, echoing the symbolic focus of the Templars. While there is no concrete evidence of a direct organizational continuation, the parallels suggest that Templar principles, practices, or ideals may have been transmitted indirectly, influencing institutions designed to preserve knowledge, values, and moral purpose. The Templars' disappearance also allowed them to become mythic figures. By erasing the organization, authorities inadvertently amplified its aura of mystery. People began to imagine hidden treasure, secret relics, and forbidden knowledge. The Grail legends, for example, became increasingly intertwined with the Templars, transforming them from mere warriors to guardians of sacred truths. Similarly, the idea that they possessed advanced geographic or navigational knowledge led to speculation that they had discovered lands beyond Europe centuries before official exploration. These myths persist because the historical record is incomplete and gaps invite projection. Central to the Templars' enduring presence is the tension between authority and autonomy. They had operated above kings, financed treasuries, and answered only to the Pope. Their independence made them powerful, and that power, in turn, made them a target. When that target was destroyed, the sudden absence of authority over what had once been untouchable inspired suspicion. It suggested that the order had always been privy to knowledge or resources beyond ordinary reach, and that the eradication of their visible power did not eliminate their potential influence. Psychologically, this enduring influence works on multiple levels. First, it creates a template for understanding lost or suppressed knowledge. The Templars become a symbol for any institution or individual that operates beyond public scrutiny, for good or ill. Second, it highlights the fragility of power. If such a disciplined and well-resourced organization could be dismantled overnight, then control over knowledge, wealth, or influence is never absolute. Third, it invites the imagination to reconstruct what cannot be observed, preserving the order in memory as both cautionary tale and source of fascination. The Templars' disappearance also underscores the limitations of historical certainty. Records were deliberately altered or destroyed, confessions were extracted under duress, and the redistribution of their assets was uneven and poorly documented. These gaps leave room for speculation and contribute to the sense that the Order's story extends beyond what is officially known. Even centuries later, every artifact, architectural symbol, or surviving document is examined for traces of continuity, whether material or ideological. In effect, the Templars achieved a form of immortality through absence. By being erased physically and legally, they were transformed culturally and symbolically. Their story could be reconstructed, reimagined, and adapted to meet the needs of subsequent generations. Secret societies, authors, historians, and enthusiasts have all participated in this reconstruction, each interpreting fragments through their own lens. This ongoing process ensures that the Templars remain more than a historical footnote. They are an enduring presence in collective imagination. Ultimately, the Knights Templar continue to captivate because they embody a paradox. They were destroyed in law and reality, yet survive in influence, symbolism, and memory. Their disappearance created the very conditions that allowed myths, legends, and theories of continuity to flourish. The combination of wealth, secrecy, martyrdom, and sudden annihilation produced a narrative that cannot be neatly concluded. Each empty vault, each missing document, each execution contributes to the sense that something vital remains hidden, waiting to be discovered. This enduring legacy extends beyond material speculation. The Templars represent the enduring tension between obedience and autonomy, between institutional authority and independent purpose, between secrecy and revelation. Their story reminds us that historical events do not exist in isolation. How institutions are remembered, mythologized, or speculated upon can shape cultural memory far more than the raw facts themselves. In this sense, the Templars' greatest power may be the very uncertainty that surrounds them, a power that allows them to persist in imagination, narrative, and symbolism centuries after their physical disappearance. By surviving in memory, the Templars achieve a kind of immortality that defies legal dissolution, political assassination, and the passage of time. They live on as models of discipline, secrecy, and moral courage. They inhabit myths of hidden knowledge, lost treasure, and forbidden truth. And in that space between history and legend, the Knights Templar remain active participants in the human imagination, reminding us that some institutions are never entirely gone. They are merely waiting to be remembered, interpreted, and rediscovered.